Forest mysteries.
The bus left Hendersonville at 20 minutes to 7. Alex Savin pulled out of the depot lot without hurrying, checked his mirrors the way he always did left, center, right, and eased onto Route 221 heading north. The radio on the dash crackled once and went quiet. Outside, the last of the daylight was draining out of the sky over the western ridge, leaving behind a thin strip of pale orange along the tree line. By the time he reached the edge of town, even that was gone. He'd driven this route 200 times, maybe more. He knew every curve, every long straightaway where the road dropped toward the valley, every tight switchback where you had to brake early or the rear end would drift. He knew the way the mountain smelled in October wet bark, cold stone, something faintly sweet from the dying leaves. He knew it the way a person knows an old piece of furniture without thinking, just by reach and feel. 11 passengers tonight. He counted them boarding a habit, not a rule. A woman with a small boy who'd immediately pressed his face against the window and fogged the glass with his breath. A big man in a sport coat who'd asked twice about the estimated arrival time before they even left the lot. A few people he'd seen on this route before, faces without names. And in the third row from the back, an old woman in a gray coat who'd settled into her seat, folded her hands in her lap, and hadn't moved since. The rain started around mile 12. Not hard, just a steady fine drizzle that turned the road surface dark and made the headlights scatter. Alex reduced his speed by 5 miles an hour and kept both hands on the wheel. The wipers swept back and forth with a low rhythmic thump. Through the rain-blurred windshield, the road ahead looked like a pale ribbon being swallowed by the dark. He was watching the shoulder when he first noticed something that made him ease off the gas without thinking. Just a reaction, the kind of thing that happens before the mind catches up. On the uphill side of the road, maybe 30 yards ahead, the embankment was different. The grass along the cut was mashed down in a way that had nothing to do with rain. The gravel at the base was scattered, spread outward, like something had recently pushed through from above. He slowed another 5 miles an hour. Behind him, the man in the sport coat, Karlov. Alex had seen the name on the roster shifted in his seat and raised his voice over the hum of the engine. "Driver, we're going to be late if you keep dropping speed every 10 minutes. Alex didn't answer right away. He was watching the shoulder. Another stretch of mashed grass further up, and what looked like a dark stain across the asphalt, not water. Something heavier. "Sir, there's weather on the pass," he said. His voice came out flat and even, the way it always did when he was paying attention to something else. "There's weather everywhere. That doesn't mean we crawl." In the third row, the little boy Danny, his mother had called him, made a small unhappy sound and pressed closer against her side. She said something quiet to him, too low for Alex to hear. The bus smelled of damp coats and the faint sweetness of someone's coffee thermos. Alex kept his eyes on the road. He'd been fired once for stopping a route without authorization. That was 8 years ago, a night not entirely unlike this one rain, mountain road, a feeling in his hands that something was wrong. He'd pulled over, refused to move for 40 minutes, and when the slide finally came, it took out a 50-foot section of the road 2 miles ahead of where he'd stopped. The company had thanked him by terminating his contract. The logic, as his supervisor had explained it, was that he'd caused a delay and hadn't followed procedure. The fact that everyone aboard was alive had apparently been beside the point. He'd found work again eventually. Different company, same road. He thought about that sometimes, not often, but on nights like this, when the mountain felt different from usual, when the ground had that particular quality of something waiting to move. "You don't know anything yet," he told himself. "Drive." The pass was 6 miles ahead. The road would narrow there, hug the cliff face on the left side, open up to a long drop on the right. There was no guardrail on the last stretch. Before the summit, the county had been planning to install one for 3 years. Alex knew the exact spot. He'd measured it once with his eyes, standing at the shoulder during a daylight stop, looking down through the trees at the creek bed 200 feet below. The wipers kept their rhythm. The rain came down a little harder. In the seat directly behind him, Danny had stopped fussing. Alex glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the boy pressed to the window again, cheek flat against the glass, watching the dark go by. His eyes were white and steady, the way children's eyes get when they're watching something they don't understand but aren't afraid of yet. Alex looked back at the road. The embankment on the right side sloped away into a tangle of rhododendron and pine. The headlights caught the white trunks of a few birches, and for a moment the trees looked almost pale blue against the dark. The road surface was solid, he could feel it through the wheel. Solid but wet, and getting wetter. At mile 23, his right front wheel dropped. Not all the way, just a few inches, enough to feel the bus lurch and pull to the right before his hands corrected. He hit the brakes smoothly, brought the vehicle to a stop, and kept the engine running. The cabin went very quiet. Through the windshield, he could see that the shoulder of the road had simply ceased to exist on the passenger's side. The embankment had collapsed silently while they drove, leaving the road edge hanging over open air. The silence inside the bus lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then everyone began talking at the same time. Karlov's voice was the loudest. The woman with Danny made a short, frightened sound. Someone in the back said what happened, and someone else said, "Oh God," and the old woman in the gray coat, the one who'd been sitting with her hands folded since Hendersonville, said nothing at all. Alex took his phone from the console and checked the signal. 1 bar, then none. He held it up toward the windshield. Nothing. He put the phone down and looked out his side window. To his right, the black edge of a mountain drop, no railing, no shoulder, nothing but dark air and the sound of water somewhere far below. To his left, the wall of the forest, close and dense, trees pressing up against the road as if they'd been waiting for exactly this. He turned off the overhead interior lights to save the battery and switched on the emergency flashers instead. The red pulse beat across the wet road surface like a slow heartbeat. 11 people, he thought. No signal, no shoulder, no way forward. He sat with both hands still on the wheel for a moment, the way he always sat when there was nothing left to do but think. They're all waiting for you to know what to do. He wasn't sure he did. The noise inside the bus thickened the air almost as fast as the smell of wet fabric, and while voices overlapped and rose and broke against each other like small waves, Alex kept both hands on the wheel, not because the bus was going anywhere now, but because letting go felt too close to admitting that he no longer had control over anything that happened next. And he needed another few seconds of the illusion before he stood up and turned to face them. He shut off the engine and listened to the way the sudden absence of vibration made every other sound sharper, from the slow drip of water somewhere near the front axle to the faint rattle of something in the overhead compartment, and behind all of it, pressed thin against the windows, the constant patter of rain on metal and glass. Like fingers tapping out a time limit he could not see, but could absolutely feel. "Everybody stay seated," he said, and his voice carried farther in the quiet than he expected, cutting through the fractured conversations, so that, one by one, people turned their heads toward the front, eyes catching the dim yellow of the ceiling lights, faces drawn and pale in a way that made each of them look a little older than they had at the station an hour ago. As if the road had taken more from them than just miles. Karlov was the first to stand anyway, planting a hand on the back of the seat in front of him as he stepped into the aisle, his jaw set in a hard line, raincoat open over the sport coat that now looked a shade too expensive for the rest of the bus, his phone still in his other hand, screen dark and useless. "You can't just sit there," he said, and it wasn't a shout, but there was enough force in it that the woman with the headphones 2 rows back flinched and pulled one earpiece off her ear, suddenly present in a way she hadn't been since they left Hendersonville. "We are hanging over a hole in the ground, and you're telling us to stay seated." Alex glanced at the instrument panel, at the warning lights that meant nothing anymore with the engine off, and then at the window again, where the right headlight caught a narrow wedge of torn earth and wet raw-looking roots, like exposed nerves, just beyond the invisible edge of the missing shoulder. The bus felt stable for the moment, nose tilted only slightly toward the drop, the weight of the vehicle still mostly on the intact part of the road, but there was a softness in the way the frame had settled that told him the ground under the tires was not something you could count on for very long. "I'm going outside to check the damage," he said, and he unbuckled his seat belt with emotion that felt far too calm for what his stomach was doing. "Everyone stays on board until I say otherwise. If you move all at once, you shift the weight, and that's the last thing we want right now." The words had the effect he needed. People froze, as if the idea of their own weight suddenly had mass they had never considered before, and even Karlov's grip on the seat in front of him tightened as he seemed to picture the bus seesawing down into the dark because he took one step in the wrong direction. The old woman in the gray coat he still didn't know her name sat as she had been sitting since the beginning of the route, hands folded on her purse, gaze directed at the floor, the only sign that she was paying attention at all being the slight tilt of her head toward his voice. Alex took the small flashlight from the bin above his seat, tested it once against the palm of his hand, and stepped down the narrow stairs to the front door, feeling the bus shift almost imperceptibly as his weight moved forward. Not enough to be dangerous yet, but enough to remind him that everything now depended on inches and balance. And how many mistakes had been made on this mountain in the last week of rain. The door opened with its usual reluctant sigh, a sound he had heard thousands of times and never thought of as anything but routine, but tonight it had an edge to it, as if the bus itself were unhappy about letting him go. The first breath of air that came in was colder than he expected, sharp and damp, carrying the smell of wet leaves and clay and something metallic, maybe from the exposed rebar of the crumbling roadbed, and for a second he stood on the threshold and listened to the night. There was the rain, of course, falling steady and fine, and beneath it the far-off rush of water from the creek in the ravine below, louder than it should have been at this distance, which meant the runoff from the slopes was already swelling it. No engine noise from above or below, no distant sweep of headlights, no dull thump of another vehicle crossing a bridge somewhere down the valley, just the mountain breathing slowly in the dark. He stepped down onto the narrow strip of asphalt in front of the bus and angled the flashlight beam along the right side, careful to keep his own feet planted well inside the faded white line that marked the outer edge of the lane. The beam picked out jagged shapes and slick surfaces, glints of water caught in broken stone. The shoulder was gone from halfway along the bus length forward, the asphalt having sheared away in a clean, cruel arc that revealed the layers beneath a stack of gravel and compacted fill and, below that, the raw clay that the road had never really attached to so much as pressed against. The right front tire sat half in the void, the lower part of the rubber hidden by the slumped soil that had spilled down toward the treetops below. Mud had swallowed it up to the rim. He saw fine rivulets of water seeping through the torn slope, cutting narrow tracks that would widen with every minute of rain, threads that would pull more of the hillside loose as they worked. He walked the length of the bus, the beam moving with him, and found that the rear wheels still had purchase, though not by a margin he would have called comfortable, the asphalt under them dark and slightly domed, as if it were already beginning to sag where the supporting soil had shifted underneath. He crouched, ignoring the way the cold water immediately soaked through the knees of his pants, and pressed a hand against the ground near the back right tire, feeling for vibration, for any subtle tremor that might mean the slope was still on the move, but the only thing he could feel was the hammer of his own blood in his fingertips. On the left side of the bus, the mountainside loomed close, the cut bank rising up in a steep wall of rock and dirt only a few steps from the wheels, beads of water clinging to the exposed strata. Here and there, small stones broke loose and clicked down to the roadside, each one a reminder that the hill above was not as solid as it looked. At the top, barely visible in the narrow angle of his light, roots stuck out of the earth in pale tangles, some already dangling free where the soil had washed out from under them, as if the trees were being slowly unhooked from the mountain, one thread at a time. He shut off the flashlight for a heartbeat and let his eyes try to adjust to the natural dark, though there was little to see beyond the faint hint of the road curving away ahead and disappearing behind the bulk of the hillside. In that moment, without artificial light, the night felt closer and heavier, as if it had stepped in to fill the space the headlamps had been pushing back. And for the first time since he had become a driver, he had the sensation that the road itself was watching him, not in any mystical sense, but with the impersonal, patient attention of something that had swallowed better men than him, and could easily do so again. He turned the beam back on and made himself walk another few yards past the front of the bus, just far enough to see where the fractured edge of asphalt met intact pavement again, a jagged lip that jutted out into space like the broken tooth of a comb. The slide that had taken the shoulder had not yet eaten far into the lane, but the collapse had undercut the outer edge, leaving a narrow arch of asphalt with nothing beneath it, the surface appearing solid until you looked under and saw the hollow. He pictured 11 people standing up at once, grabbing bags from overhead compartments, shifting, stumbling, putting weight on the wrong part of the floor. And he imagined the sickening moment when the arch gave way, the sudden tilt, the sound the bus would make as it tore free and rolled. When he climbed back inside, the warmth and closeness of the cabin hit him in a wave that smelled of anxiety as much as wet clothing. Conversations that had died down while he was outside flared again at the sight of his face, as if each person had been holding a question in their throat and the act of seeing him triggered it. "Well," Karlov said, still in the aisle, shoulders squared, eyes bright with anger that sat barely a layer above fear. "We need to move this thing before more of the road disappears, and if we can't drive it out, we push, we unload, we do something. We do not just sit here like ducks waiting for the rest of the mountain to go." At the back, Danny had finally fallen asleep with his head in his mother's lap, his small sneakered feet jutting out into the aisle at an odd angle, one sock slipping down his ankle, his damp hair plastered to his forehead. Marina Alex didn't know her name yet, but he noticed the way she kept one arm around the boy and the other braced on the armrest, as if ready to stand up quickly and shield him from a danger she could not yet define. Old Ruth, gray coat buttoned to the throat, had opened her purse and taken out a battered metal thermos that looked as if it had been crossing mountains longer than most of the passengers had been alive. Without a word, she poured steaming tea into the plastic cap and handed it to the woman in the next seat, who accepted it with a shaky, automatic sort of gratitude, like a person who has been handed a life preserver before she has fully realized she is drowning. "The right front wheel is buried in mud where the shoulder used to be," Alex said, taking a breath that filled his chest only halfway and letting it out slowly while he watched their faces the way they changed as he spoke. "The ground under us is saturated and still settling. If we all get out and start pushing, we put more weight on the weakest side of the road, and we risk the whole thing going with us on it. We stay on board for now." Karlov took a step toward him, the bus shifting almost imperceptibly under the redistributed weight, and several people gripped their armrests automatically. "For now," he repeated, voice tight. "And what happens when for now becomes the bus is starting to slide, and we are still sitting on it because you didn't want to make a decision that might get you in trouble with your dispatcher?" Alex met his eyes and, for a second, saw not the man in front of him, but his old supervisor from 8 years ago, standing in a fluorescent hallway with a clipboard, explaining that good intentions were not a defense against company policy. The memory flashed and faded, leaving behind a familiar sour taste. "My dispatcher isn't here," he said, and he was surprised to hear the edge in his own voice, the roughness that had not been there at the start of the route. "The mountain is. The bus is. That's what I'm looking at." Marina spoke up then, her voice quieter than Karlov's, but somehow cutting through his just the same, maybe because of the way she clutched Danny a little tighter as she did. "If the ground keeps moving while we sit here," she said, eyes on Alex, not on Karlov, "what happens to us, to him, if we wait too long? Are you sure we're safer inside than on the road?" Her question hung between them like another weight to be balanced, and he could feel the attention of the other passengers shift with it, as if they were all leaning toward him a fraction of an inch without moving in their seats, hoping that somewhere inside his head there was an answer he had not yet spoken. He thought about the road ahead, about the fact that the nearest town, a cluster of lights he'd passed 100 times and never stopped in, lay miles beyond the pass, and that to reach it on foot, they would have to walk along this same narrow strip of asphalt, with the ravine yawning on one side and the unstable hillside looming on the other in rain and dark, with a child and an old woman, and at least one man nursing an injury from that awkward attempt to push the bus a few minutes earlier. He thought about leaving them here alone, the bus a dim yellow capsule hanging on the edge of the world, while he picked his way down some half-remembered service track through the forest in search of help, trusting that the mountain would be kind enough to hold still until he came back. He thought about the way his hands had felt the subtle give in the ground near the rear tires when he had knelt in the rain. "We're safer inside than outside for the next hour," he said finally, feeling the words settle into place like something heavy clicking into a groove it had been moving toward from the moment the tire dropped. After that, if the rain keeps up and the ground changes, that might not be true anymore. "So what do you propose?" Karlov said, and there was something almost desperate under the sarcasm now, a man whose sense of control over his life depended on being able to turn anger into a plan. "You sit here and monitor the ground like a doctor checking a pulse, while the rest of us trust you not to miss the moment when it's time to run." Alex looked past him to the window where the forest pressed close, trees crowding against the glass, branches dripping and swaying, the world beyond reduced to a pattern of dark verticals and ghostly reflections of the interior lighting. Between the trunks, the slope dropped away into blackness that his eyes could not penetrate. "We wait," he said, the word tasting like metal on his tongue because he hated it almost as much as Karlov clearly did. "I go back out. I check the ground every 15 minutes. If I see any sign the bus is shifting, we start moving people off, one by one, lightest first, to the uphill side, and we figure out from there whether we try for the pass or head back toward town on foot. But right now, stepping out into that rain in a group, on a road with no shoulder, in the dark with that drop right beside us, is more dangerous than staying put." He could see the calculations happening on their faces, the way fear and common sense wrestled with each other and produced nothing like certainty, but at least something like reluctant acceptance. Even Karlov's shoulders dropped a fraction, the set of his jaw loosening, as he realized that there were no neat answers here, no solution that didn't involve risk. Alex sank back into the driver's seat because there was nowhere else for him to stand without blocking the aisle, and the chair, worn and molded to his shape over years of roots, felt suddenly alien, a place where he was supposed to be a man who knew what to do, when in truth he was sitting here stitching a plan together from experience and fear and the thin fragile hope that the mountain would give him time. He looked at the reflection of the cabin in the wide mirror above the windshield, at the faces turned toward him, some openly, some in stolen sideways glances, each one carrying its own private version of the same question. And he thought about his daughter at home, about the plate she would have set for him at dinner, without really thinking about whether he would be on time. Because most nights he was, and how the phone on the hook in the little kitchen would sit there in silence now, no ring. Because there was no signal on this side of the pass. The bus creaked, a soft, tired noise that could have been metal cooling or the chassis settling another millimeter into the soft ground, and a few people flinched as if struck from behind. Old Ruth lifted the thermos again, poured more tea without looking at anyone, then snapped the cup back into place with a quiet finality that made the small sound feel louder than it was. "Someone is going to have to go," she said, not raising her voice, not addressing anyone by name, just setting the words in the air where everyone could hear them, and letting them land where they would. The bus fell silent in the wake of that simple statement, the idea of departure suddenly upright and solid among them, and every eye that had been wandering, every gaze that had been flicking between window and floor and seat back, turned in the same direction as inevitably as if a string had been pulled. They looked at Alex. Alex sat there long enough for the weight of their eyes to turn from pressure into something like gravity, a pull that made it harder to draw breath, and even though nobody spoke after old Ruth's simple statement, The quiet in the bus grew louder with every passing second, filled with the unasked questions and the private calculations that every person was now doing. Not just about the road and the rain and the absent signal bars, but about themselves and what they were capable of if it came to that impossible moment when a choice had to be made between staying put in a metal shell that might slide into the ravine and walking out into a mountain night that could swallow them in different ways. He could have waited for someone else to volunteer, could have watched to see if one of the younger men, the ones who had already tried to push the bus and come back with mud up to their knees and shame in their eyes, would stand up again and offer themselves as the obvious candidates. But he knew, as clearly as he knew the curve of the road outside, that they were not looking for a volunteer chosen by chance or bravado. They were looking at the person who, in their collective minds, already carried responsibility for where they were and what would happen next, and he realized with a kind of tired clarity that he had been waiting for this moment since his hands had first tightened on the wheel at mile 12, and the embankment had looked wrong. "I'll go," he said, and the words didn't feel heroic or dramatic as they left his mouth. They felt inevitable, like the release of air from a pressure valve that had been slowly turning for the last hour, and as soon as they were spoken, the bus seemed to breathe with him, a soft exhale that moved through the cabin in the rustle of fabric, the shifting of feet, the way shoulders sagged or straightened in tiny increments. Karlov opened his mouth, perhaps to argue that he should be the one or to object that the driver leaving the bus was some violation of a regulation he could use later. But whatever he was about to say died halfway out when he glanced at the window and caught a flash of movement there, just the trembling shadow of a branch sliding across the glass. And he closed his jaw again with an audible click, as if reminded that the mountain outside did not care about his meetings or his sense of how things ought to work. Marina's hand tightened on Danny's shoulder, the boy still asleep, oblivious to the way the air around him had changed, and she looked at Alex with an expression that tried to be steady, but could not quite hide the way fear had hollowed out her cheeks, making the bones stand out more sharply beneath the dim yellow cabin lights. "How far is it?" she asked, and even though the question was simple, the answer was anything but, because he could not tell her the only real truth, that in this weather, in this dark, distance was not measured in miles so much as in the number of decisions you made, without knowing whether any of them were right. 5 miles if I cut through the woods, he said, rounding his estimates down almost by reflex, as if shaving distance off the number might shave dread from her eyes, maybe 8 or 9 along the road. But the pass ahead is worse than the stretch, and the slope drops faster, so I won't take the asphalt unless I have to. She swallowed, throat working, then nodded slowly, as if she were signing a form no one had put in front of her, some internal consent document that acknowledged she understood the risks and accepted them because she had no other choice. "Will you come back?" she said, and there was no accusation in it, just a plain raw question from someone who had built her life around the assumption that when people said they would return, they usually did. He thought about lying, about giving her the easy answer that would let her sit for a while longer with a smaller knot in her chest. But the mountain had already stripped away enough illusions tonight, and he did not want to add another thin layer. That might tear at the first hard pull. "I'm going to try," he said instead, and he held her gaze while he said it, letting her see the uncertainty there, not because he wanted to frighten her further, but because he knew from experience that people could handle fear better than betrayal. And nothing felt quite as much like betrayal as a promise broken in a place that did not forgive mistakes. He stood up, feeling the stiffness in his knees from kneeling on wet asphalt earlier, and reached into the overhead compartment for his jacket, which was still dry, only because he had not needed it between the station and here. The lining felt strangely cold under his fingers, as if it already knew what kind of night it was about to be dragged into. From the seat where he had been arguing with such ferocity 15 minutes earlier, Karlov surprised him by shrugging out of his own heavier coat a dark, expensive-looking thing with a quilted lining and stepping into the aisle to hold it out. his expression oddly blank now, like a man who had shifted from one plan to another so quickly that his face had not yet caught up. "Take this," he said, the words sounding forced in his throat, as if generosity were a language he was out of practice speaking. "Yours is too thin for that rain, and if you freeze out there and don't make it, we all have a problem." Alex hesitated, an old reflex telling him to refuse on principle, to avoid any sense that he owed this man something beyond what the job already demanded. But the memory of the cold wind at the open door and the smell of wet mountain air overrode that impulse with simple practicality, and he accepted the coat with a brief nod, sliding his arms into sleeves that were a little too long and feeling the padded warmth settle around his shoulders like borrowed armor. "Thank you," he said, and it was not a big word or a loud one, but it shifted something small and important between them, enough that Karlov looked away, uncomfortable, as if he had just been seen in a mirror he did not particularly like. Alex checked his phone, more out of habit than hope, and saw the battery indicator at 34%, the empty bars where reception should have been like teeth knocked out of a jaw. He put it in his pocket anyway, knowing that if he could gain even one bar on a ridge or near a clearing, the difference between silence and a single broken call might be measured in how long the bus stayed where it was. He took the small folding knife he kept in the glove box, a simple utilitarian thing with a worn handle and a blade that had opened packages and cut rope, and trimmed loose threads from the bus's tattered seat covers over the years, and slipped it into the pocket of Karlov's coat, not because he thought he would be fighting off anything larger than his own thoughts out there, but because having a piece of sharpened steel in his hand sometimes made the unknown feel slightly less indifferent. Danny stirred as he moved past, one small sneaker shifting, the toes brushing against the aisle, and Marina bent down to smooth the boy's hair back from his forehead, her fingers gentle and automatic, then looked up once more. "If something happens here," she said, voice catching a little on the first word, "if the ground starts to move again, what do we do?" "You listen to the hill," he said, surprised at himself for putting it that way, the phrase falling out of some old memory of his father, describing the way a slope would talk to you before it went, in groans and rustles and small stony sighs. "If you feel a shift, if you hear anything that isn't wind or rain, you move to the left side, the uphill side, low and fast, one at a time, not all at once. You stay away from the right windows. You don't panic." He knew, of course, that telling people not to panic was like telling the rain not to fall, but sometimes saying it bought a handful of seconds, in which they might remember that they did have choices about how their bodies responded to fear, even if the larger situation was out of their control. He walked to the front of the bus, the weight of eyes following him in the mirror, and paused with his hand on the rail by the steps, feeling the subtle sway of the vehicle under him, the tiny noise the frame made when someone shifted in their seat, the rustle of clothing, the quiet clearing of a throat. Behind all of that, layered under human sounds, the bus itself had a presence, a machine that had carried thousands of lives over miles of road, now reduced to a stranded animal with its front leg caught, waiting to see whether the ground that held it would be merciful or not. At the very back, old Ruth lifted her head and looked at him directly for the first time that night, her eyes surprisingly bright and clear in her lined face. And for a second he thought she might say something like a blessing or an admonition, some phrase rooted in mountain churches or older things that people whispered in kitchens, but she only inclined her head in a tiny nod, as if acknowledging that the world had turned to this particular point and there was nothing left now but to see it through. He stepped down into the stairwell, pressed the button to open the door, and felt the immediate rush of cold wet air push in against him, carrying the smell of rain that had been falling for hours now, saturating everything, seeping into soil and rock and bark, turning the forest into a sponge that squeezed out water with every small movement. The first step onto the asphalt felt different from when he had gone out to check the wheels earlier, not because the road had changed in those few minutes, though it undoubtedly had in ways too small for his senses to catch, but because he now knew that this was not a quick inspection, followed by the relative safety of the driver's seat, this was him turning his back on the bright, contained space of the bus and walking into a dark that had no walls, no handrails, no overhead lights he could flip on and off. The rain hit his face like a sheet of cold needles, driven sideways by a wind that had picked up a little since his last trip outside, and he pulled Karlov's coat tighter around his chest, grateful for the way the thick fabric turned most of the water aside, though it could do nothing about the damp that already lived in the air itself, soaking his hair, sliding down the back of his neck in thin, unpleasant streams. He took 3 steps along the side of the bus, careful to stay inside the lane, and then stopped, turning his head to look at the trees on the uphill side, the dark shapes pressed together, trunks like crowded pillars, branches thick and heavy with wet leaves that gleamed faintly in the reflected glow of the headlights. Somewhere beyond that first rank of trees, the land rose and fell and twisted in ways he knew only from maps and glimpses through the windshield, and he tried to overlay those paper lines on the reality in front of him, to imagine the ridges and hollows hidden by the dark. The road ahead curved out of sight around the shoulder of the mountain, a pale, slick arc that vanished into shadow where the headlamps could not reach, and the thought of walking along it, hugging the wall of rock, while a long, unguarded drop yawned a few feet away, felt like willingly stepping out onto the narrow lip of a dam in flood. The woods, by contrast, offered cover and the illusion of options, but they also held their own kinds of danger, from unseen gullies to roots, ready to twist an ankle, to the simple disorienting sameness of trees, one after another, until all sense of direction turned to mush. He angled the flashlight into the forest and saw the faint suggestion of a deer path or old service track leading away from the road, not much more than a thinning in the undergrowth, a line where the fallen leaves looked slightly more disturbed, where the wet soil gleamed with a few scattered prints that could have belonged to any number of animals that moved through these hills at night. It wasn't much, but it was something, and he found himself stepping toward it almost before he had consciously decided that this would be his route. He paused at the edge of the tree line and turned back to look at the bus one last time. From out here, with the interior lights dimmed and the emergency flashers pulsing red against the wet metal skin, it looked less like a familiar workplace and more like a fragile, stubborn bubble of human life, stuck where no such thing was meant to be, its windows glowing faintly with trapped warmth and nervous movement. The people inside reduced to vague silhouettes behind the glass. He could make out Marina's profile, bent over Danny, and the hunched shape of Karlov near the front, one hand braced on a seat back, the other probably still wrapped around his phone, thumb rubbing at the smooth, useless screen. Old Rufe's gray coat was just a smudge near the rear, still as stone. He raised a hand, not quite a wave, more a small gesture of acknowledgement to them and to the bus itself, then turned back to the trees, feeling the boundary between asphalt and soil under his boots, as he stepped off the road and into the forest proper. The sensation was immediate and startling. The ground here was softer and less predictable, the layer of wet leaves sliding under his soles, twigs snapping in sharp, tiny protests, the mud beneath giving way in slow, sucking motions that tugged at his feet, and the sound of the rain changed to, becoming less a direct assault and more a constant susurration above him, as water filtered through the canopy, dripping from branch to branch before finally reaching him. He walked slowly at first, picking his way between trunks, feeling for the faint line of the path with his boots rather than trusting his eyes, which were busy trying to pull meaning out of a world reduced to shades of black, and the narrow, washed-out cone of his flashlight. Every time the beam swung across the forest floor, it caught the glint of wet stone, the pale flash of exposed root, the occasional discarded beer can or plastic bottle that proved other people had been here in daylight, following the same uncertain route towards something mundane like a fishing spot or a hunting stand. Behind him, the bus's headlamps cast his shadow long and thin across the first few yards of undergrowth, making him look stretched and spindly, a fragile figure leaning too far toward the unknown, and he thought, briefly, of how this must look from inside, the driver who was supposed to be the steady center of the night, shrinking with every step, until he was just another dark shape swallowed by the trees. After perhaps 20 paces, he turned his head instinctively to check the bus again and found that it had already faded, the glow of the headlights fractured by trunks and branches, until all that remained was a faint diffused brightening between the trees, as if someone had hung a dim lantern at the edge of a camp a long way back. He felt a small sharp twist in his chest at that realization, not quite regret and not quite fear, but something that contained pieces of both, and he understood, in a way that no amount of practical talk could have conveyed, that he had crossed a threshold that he would not be able to step back over quickly, if at all. He stopped and listened, holding his breath, letting the ordinary noises of the night arrange themselves around him. There was the constant rain, softened now but still steady, the distant rush of the creek far below, the intermittent drip of water falling from branch to branch, the faint creak of trunks shifting under their own wet weight, and, beneath all of that, a deeper quiet that was not quite silence, a kind of thick, waiting stillness that made the hairs on his arms stand up because it felt less like the absence of sound, and more like the presence of something that simply was not making any. The forest did not care that he was there, he knew that rationally, yet standing in the dark with the taste of cold metal and wet earth in his mouth, he could not shake the sense that, at the very least, it had registered his arrival, the way a house registers the movement of someone walking through its rooms, floorboards complaining quietly, the air shifting in subtle currents. He adjusted the strap of his flashlight on his wrist, checked that the knife in his pocket had not shifted, and took another step forward, then another, feeling the forest close around him with every pace, the bus behind him receding not just in distance, but in the part of his mind that had been clinging to it as a fixed point, a place he could return to simply by turning around and retracing his steps. It would still be there, he told himself, because it had to be, because the alternative was unthinkable, but as he moved deeper between the trees, his world shrank to the circle of light at his feet, the sound of his own breathing, and the steady patient darkness pressing in on all sides. He tried at first to make every step an act of deliberate intention, placing his boots where the faint suggestion of a path seemed to run, keeping his body angled slightly downhill, so that the slope guided him toward the valley where, on the map in his head, Pinewood sat with its handful of streets and a volunteer fire station and, more importantly than anything else right now, old men with trucks and tractors and a sense of obligation that did not require dispatcher's approval. And as long as he could hold that picture steady in his mind, the forest felt like a series of obstacles to be negotiated, rather than a single seamless threat. The ground under him rolled in a way that was more complex than it had seemed from the road. Small ridges rose and fell without much warning, and shallow dips, disguised by leaves and undergrowth, turned into sudden slick hollows where water had gathered, so that his weight would shift unexpectedly and send a quick twist of pain up through his ankles and knees, while the rain, though no longer hammering down, filtered through the canopy in endless drops that found their way into his collar and cuffs and down along his spine, until there was no part of him that did not feel at least slightly wet. It would have been easy, in that kind of discomfort, to let his mind narrow to a single thread 1 foot, then the other, keep the flashlight steady, don't fall, but he knew that as soon as he stopped paying attention to the larger shapes of the land. 2, whether he was generally trending down or inadvertently climbing back up, he would be giving the forest permission to fold itself around him and erase the notion of direction altogether. So he forced himself to notice the angle of his calves as he walked, the way his thighs burned more when he was pushing uphill even on short rises, the shift in the sound of his breathing when the slope demanded more from his lungs. Somewhere to his right, unseen through the dense trunks and the curtain of branches, he could still hear the creek, its voice deeper and more constant now that he had left the road, a steady rumble that rose in volume when he dipped lower and thinned out when he climbed, and he kept it there intentionally, not by his side, but in his awareness, like an old trail hand's companion whose presence marked the edge of safe territory, as long as the water stayed roughly where he expected it to be. He could pretend that his mental map and the real mountain still overlapped. He thought of his father as he walked, not in the abstract way he sometimes did on long routes, but in specific remembered scenes: his dad standing in the narrow backyard of their rental house in Oregon, drawing a crude cross-section of a hill in the cracked concrete with a piece of chalk, explaining how, if you got turned around in the woods in bad weather, you could trust the way water behaved more than you could trust your own sense of straight lines. Because water always went down, and down meant valleys and people and roads, whereas fear had a bad habit of bending every path into a circle. Feet don't lie, his father had said, tapping the chalk at the steepest part of his drawing, his work boots leaving dusty prints on the ground, his breath smelling of coffee and cheap spearmint gum. You pay attention to what they're telling you about up and down, and you use that because your eyes will get fooled once the landmarks start looking all the same. Now, with the beam of his flashlight flattening the shapes of roots and rocks into a narrow band of gray and black, and the trees around him merging into a repeating pattern that offered no obvious points of reference, he understood in a way he never had on that bright afternoon how easily a person could lose the thread of direction. How quickly the confident idea of "I'm going this way" could dissolve into "I'm not sure where this is anymore," especially when there was no line of sight beyond 10 yards, and the only consistent thing was the sound of his own breath and the drum of blood in his ears. The path he had been following forked sooner than he liked, splitting into two possibilities that peeled away from each other at a shallow angle, both of them leading generally downslope, both choked with wet leaves and glistening roots, both framed by the same close-set trunks, and for a moment he stood at the division, sweeping the flashlight first along the left branch and then the right, searching for some difference that would declare itself as the better choice: more disturbed soil on one side, perhaps, or an old boot print softened by rain, but the forest had a way of blurring those markers, and whatever subtle variations existed there, his eyes, strained by darkness and the narrow focus of the beam, could not catch them. The right-hand branch was slightly wider, with fewer low bushes crowding its edges, and it had the look of something that had been used regularly, by deer or people or both, a faint gutter worn into the mud where countless small feet had slipped and recovered, whereas the left-hand trail was more constricted, its center line stitched with a narrow strip of flattened grass that seemed fresher, a sign that someone or something heavier than the usual forest traffic had come this way not long ago and disturbed the pressed layer of leaves enough to reveal the pale blades beneath. Rain fell between the branches, making tiny concentric circles on every patch of exposed soil, washing away edges and footprints even as he watched. And he had the unsettling sensation of time speeding up around him, of the mountain, trying to erase any trace of other travelers as quickly as possible, so that whoever walked these paths next would find them as blank as he did now. The logical part of his mind, the one that still thought in terms of route maps and schedules and posted detour signs, argued for the right-hand path because wider usually meant more traveled. More traveled usually meant it went somewhere that people had wanted to go more than once. And somewhere people go was the closest thing to safety that he could hope for in this environment, while another, quieter part of him, the one that remembered stories of hunters' shortcuts and locals' barely visible tracks through the trees, tugged his attention to the left, to that thin line of fresh flattening, as if to say that the most direct way was rarely the one most obvious to outsiders. He stood there a moment longer, feeling the cold soak deeper into his shirt and the weight of Karlov's coat increasing with moisture, the rain working its way into his seams and cuffs, despite the initial resistance of the fabric, and he thought about the bus behind him, about the way the lights would be pressing against the dark, and about the fact that every minute he spent hesitating here was another minute that water had to work on the cut bank and the weakened shoulder. Another minute in which the mountain could decide to shrug the road off its back. In the end, he chose the wider path, telling himself that this was not the time to be romantic about hidden tracks and secret locals' knowledge, that he was already playing enough games with probability, without adding a preference for mystery over practicality to the mix, and as he stepped onto the right-hand trail, he tried to ignore the small irrational pang of regret for the road not taken, as if some version of him in another possible night were moving along that narrower way toward a different outcome. The first few yards gave him a false sense of reassurance. The trail held its general downward trend, the sound of the creek grew louder and more distinct, and the slope of the ground under his boots felt consistent with the mental model he'd been carrying, a steady descent toward a valley floor that he hoped would open eventually into fields and, beyond them, a scattering of houses. He let his thoughts stretch ahead, imagining the moment when he would step out of the tree line into a clearing and see, in the middle distance, the faint blessed glow of porch lights and the square shapes of buildings against the sky, and that image warmed him more than Karlov's coat did, a small bright point of future possibility pulling him along. He walked like that for a while. He had no precise sense of how long, because time was starting to slide the way the ground did, losing clear edges, minutes smearing together as his focus narrowed to not tripping, not twisting an ankle, not letting the flashlight beam drift so far ahead that he missed a hole right under his nose, and at some point he realized that the creek sound, which had been a steady rising roar to his right, had softened and shifted, seeming further away, as if he had been moving along a gentle arc instead of a straight line, and the valley floor was no longer directly beneath him. He stopped, breathing hard now, more from tension than from the exertion of what could not have been more than a few hundred yards, and turned his head slowly, listening the way his father had taught him, trying to parse the forest's layered noises into something that made sense. The rain was lighter, almost a fine mist now, its sound more like a constant hushed whisper than a drumbeat, and through it he could hear the creek, but it was no longer clearly on one side. Instead, its voice seemed to seep up from multiple directions, bouncing off unseen rock faces, refracted by the close-standing trunks, so that when he pivoted, eyes closed. The sound followed him in a disorienting way, never quite settling in one place. An uneasy warmth curled low in his stomach, an echo of the stories he had read about people walking in circles in the woods while swearing they had held to a straight line, about how the absence of far horizons, and the repetition of near objects tree, rock, root, tree, rock, root could scramble the brain's internal compass, until it began inventing patterns just to fill the void where certainty used to be. He opened his eyes and stared at the path ahead, then back the way he had come, but the two directions looked so similar that, for an awful second, he was not entirely sure which one led toward the bus, and which one led away from it. He took his phone out and checked the time, partly to distract himself from that pinch of panic, and partly to anchor this moment in something measurable. 11:04 p.m. The digital numbers told him, tiny and indifferent on their faintly glowing background, and the battery icon had slipped down to 21%. A fact that registered in his mind with a quiet click, another meter ticking inexorably toward empty. He told himself that he had been walking for maybe 40 minutes since leaving the road, give or take, accounting for stops and hesitations, which meant that, at an ordinary walking pace, he should have covered something like 1.5 miles, perhaps 2, but the forest did not operate on ordinary metrics, and his legs felt as if they had been lifting more than distance, as if they had been carrying the weight of each decision along with his body. He turned slowly in a full circle, the flashlight beam casting a thin ring of light that swept over trunks and undergrowth and wet gleaming patches of soil, and as it came around for the second time, he felt a jolt of cold recognition that had nothing to do with the weather, because the beam illuminated a cluster of objects at the base of a tree that he knew he had already seen tonight, a narrow sapling bent at an awkward angle, a rock with a flat, slightly lighter face than the ones around it, and, hanging from a low branch a few feet above the ground, a rusting aluminum can tie it on with a length of old twine. He had half registered the can earlier as a relic from some hunter or teenager, one of those arbitrary markers that people left in woods, for reasons that were obvious only to them, and he had not thought much of it then, other than a small flicker of gratitude that there were, in fact, signs of human passage in this forest. Seeing it again now, in what his body insisted was a new location, but which the evidence suggested was the same, sent a quick, dizzying wave of unreality through him, as if the ground had just shifted sideways under his feet by a few inches. He walked closer to the tree to be sure, lifting the can gently with his fingers, feeling the familiar roughness of oxidized metal, the way it stuck slightly to his skin from the wet. The twine was frayed in precisely the same places he remembered, fibers splayed like old rope on a dock, and there, near the knot, was the thin streak of blue paint he had noticed and dismissed earlier as a meaningless detail. It was not just another can, it was the can. Somewhere in the back of his brain, a small cold voice said, "You've turned yourself around. You've walked a loop. You are burning time and battery and strength on a circle that comes back on itself." And behind that voice, deeper and more guttural, came the beginning of panic, not the sharp screaming kind that made people bolt blindly, but the low simmering kind that tightened the chest and sped the thoughts and whispered that if you could make such a big mistake without noticing, then maybe none of your decisions tonight were as solid as you told yourself they were. He forced himself to stand perfectly still, feeling the weight of the coat on his shoulders, the slick dampness of the tree bark under his free hand, the way his heart was beating faster than it should have been for the level of exertion. And he remembered another of his father's sayings, tossed off once at the edge of a campground when they'd taken a wrong turn on a trail, and ended up at the same log twice. Getting lost is mostly about speed, his father had said, laughing it off then in a way that had not fully conveyed the seriousness behind the words. You move too fast for your brain to keep up and make a map. You pull ahead of your own sense of where you've been, and by the time you stop, you've tied yourself in knots. Stop early, you untangle easier. So he stopped. He shut off the flashlight, plunging himself into a darkness so sudden and absolute that he felt momentarily weightless, as if someone had removed the floor and ceiling of the world and left him hanging in an empty space where sound and touch were the only anchors left. The rain on the leaves seemed louder with his vision gone, each drop a tiny drum beat, and the creek's voice came back into focus as a steady growl from somewhere beyond the trees, not attached to a direction so much as to a dimension, a low undercurrent that he could, if he listened long enough, begin to place in relation to the slope under his feet. He flexed his toes inside his damp boots, paying attention to the pull in his calves, the way his weight wanted to slide slightly forward if he relaxed, and from that, deduced that, wherever he had turned himself, he was still standing on ground that sloped downward in a particular direction, and if he committed to that, if he trusted the angle of his own legs more than the tricks of paths and cans and circling thoughts, he could re-establish some kind of forward progress. The cold crept in faster without the light, as if the beam had been a thin symbolic barrier against the night, and he clicked the flashlight back on, its narrow cone suddenly precious again, forming a small island of visibility in a sea of dark. The can swung slightly on its twine where he had disturbed it, creaking faintly, and the sound, though tiny, sent a brief ripple of unease up his spine. Because it did not belong to rain or creek or wind, it belonged to action, to a thing moved by a hand, even if that hand had been his own. He checked the time once more, not because knowing would change anything, but because he needed to anchor this realization to numbers 11:10 p.m. In the roughly 40 minutes since he had left the bus, he had apparently walked himself in a rough loop, large enough to disguise itself as forward movement, and if he did not adjust now, he would keep spiraling like that until exhaustion or sunrise or something worse intervened. A dry, humorless thought flickered through him that if this had been a story he was reading in a warm room somewhere, he would have rolled his eyes at the character who walked in circles in the woods and failed to notice the signs, but the mountain had a way of stripping away the smugness of distance, of reminding you that it was one thing to understand a behavior in theory, and another to feel your own mind tugged toward it by fear and fatigue. He drew a slow breath, let it out through his nose, and turned his attention outward again, listening past the noise of his own body to the forest itself. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the edge of his light, a branch shifted with a soft, damp thud. As accumulated water slid off it, and further away, maybe on the next ridge, there was a faint cracking sound, like wood giving way under pressure, followed by a muted crash that could have been a small slide or just a dead tree, finally collapsing after years of rot. The creek's rumble seemed a fraction louder in one particular quadrant of the circle he traced with his ears, and he oriented his body toward that, using the slope under his boots to confirm that this direction would take him downward, not back up. It was as much art as science, this attempt to make choices based on feel and sound rather than sight, and he knew he could still be wrong, but doing nothing, standing here in this small pool of light with the can creaking quietly over his shoulder, and the knowledge of his loop pressing on his nerves felt more dangerous than moving with imperfect information. He started walking again, this time less concerned with the visible line of any particular path, and more focused on the consistent sensation of descent, letting his feet tell him when the ground steepened or flattened, adjusting his stride accordingly, and as he moved away from the tree with the can, he felt, or imagined he felt, the forest watching him in a new way, as if it had noticed that he had noticed its little trick and was now slightly more interested in what he would do next. He walked with the careful determination of someone who knows that the moment he lets his mind drift, his feet will carry him into patterns he will not recognize until it is too late. And for a while that was enough to hold the dread at bay, because the act of paying such close attention to the angle of the slope and the faint variations in the creek's voice kept him too busy to dwell on the larger truth that he was alone in a wet, unfamiliar forest with a dwindling battery and 11 lives waiting on the strength of his decisions. The beam of the flashlight carved out a moving tunnel through the dark, catching the slick shine of mud and rock, the pale flash of exposed roots that twisted like veins across the forest floor, the occasional startled gleam of a spider's web strung between low branches, beaded with water like a necklace tossed aside. And he found that if he let his gaze linger on those small details, the world shrank to a manageable scale, a series of immediate problems. Don't step there, watch that branch. Adjust your balance on this slope instead of an overwhelming landscape of potential failure. Still, fear was an insistent thing, and it did not need wide vistas to work. It could slip into the narrowest spaces, filling the gaps between one careful step and the next with images and questions. And as the minutes crawled past, something in the back of his mind began to tug against the discipline he was trying to maintain, whispering that the bus was further away now than it had ever been, that the rain had been falling steadily on that cut bank the entire time he had been under the trees, that any small sound he thought heard behind him could be rock giving way, metal shifting, people shouting. He resisted the urge to turn around and look, knowing that the bus was already out of sight, and that seeing nothing but the thick density of black trunks between him and where he had come from would do nothing to settle him, and instead tried to anchor himself to the thought of Annie at home, imagining her asleep in her small room with the glow in the dark stars they had stuck to the ceiling still faintly visible in the ambient street light, her breath slow and even, unaware that somewhere her father was picking his way through a mountain he had driven around but never through. The thought of her mate is chest tight in a different way, because it drew a direct line between this cold, wet present and a future he wanted desperately to reach. And with that came the awareness that there was a version of this night in which he did not, that the mountain took him not in some dramatic avalanche, but in a series of small misjudgments that led to a bad fall. A broken leg, a phone battery blinking out in his hand, the bus behind him sliding silently into the ravine while he lay somewhere unable to move, listening to the distant crack and rush, powerless to do anything. His breathing grew faster, not because the terrain had suddenly steepened, but because his thoughts had, and he recognized, with a cold clarity sharpened by years of managing other people's panic behind him on the bus, that he was starting to lose the thin line between productive fear, the kind that kept you sharp, and the kind that fogged your decision-making, pushing you into the very errors you were trying to avoid. The forest pressed closer in his mind, trunks leaning, branches reaching, shadows thickening, even though he knew intellectually that nothing about the physical space had changed in the last 30 seconds. He forced himself to slow down, shortening his stride, counting his breaths out of habit, but the numbers tangled with the looped thoughts in his head. 11 people. 8 years since the last accident, 5 miles, 21% battery, 1 daughter, 1 bus, 1 man, and the arithmetic only made the tightness in his chest worse, because every figure seemed to resolve into some variation of not enough. Not enough time, not enough margin, not enough certainty. The ground here had become less obviously sloped, the descent smoothing into a broad ambiguous plain, where his legs no longer sent clear signals about up and down, and that subtle flattening, combined with the loss of the creek's distinct roar, had faded into a kind of omnipresent murmur. That might have been coming from any direction, left him feeling unmoored in a way that went beyond geography, as if the mountain had quietly removed the last visible strings connecting him to a sense of this way is forward, and was waiting to see whether he would notice. He did notice, but the recognition did not come with a solution. It came with a wave of nausea that rose from his stomach and lodged at the base of his throat, a sour metallic taste that had nothing to do with the air, and for a moment he had the absurd urge to sit down and put his head between his knees, like they taught you to do if you felt faint, as if the forest were a workplace and someone might come over with a cup of water and a paper towel. Instead, he stumbled to a halt beside a fallen log, its bark slick and dark with moisture, and leaned against it, his palms slipping slightly before finding purchase on a rough knot. The contact with solid wood both grounding and unpleasant, because it reminded him of just how much of the world around him was soaked, living. Indifferent matter that did not care whether he stood or fell. His heart was pounding hard enough that he could feel it in his fingertips, in his throat, even in the tender spot behind his eyes, and his thoughts, which he had held in a fairly straight line for the first part of the walk, seemed to explode outward in multiple directions at once, spiraling into old memories and future catastrophes, replaying the moments 8 years ago when he had stopped the bus against orders, the way the supervisor had looked at him afterward. That mixture of relief and annoyance, the way his own certainty had curdled into doubt under the weight of punishment. "You're doing it again," a voice in his head said, not his father's this time, not any one's in particular, just the amalgamated tone of every critic, professional and internal, that had ever told him that his instincts were as likely to ruin things as to save them. You chose the forest over the road because you thought you knew better than the route. What if that was the wrong call? What if every step you've taken since the tire dropped has been another layer on a mistake you'll never be able to peel back? His hand, still braced on the log, began to tremble, and he realized with a faint detached curiosity that it was close to the edge where people started doing stupid things, running without a plan, shouting into the dark, wasting battery by flicking the flashlight on and off in a frantic attempt to see more than the beam would allow, calling names of people who couldn't hear them in a futile attempt to outrun the rising sense of being lost, not just in space, but in themselves. He lowered himself onto the log, the wet seeping instantly through the seat of his pants, the shock of cold almost a relief, because it was a sensation tied to the present moment, not to possibilities or memories. He sat there, hunched, the flashlight resting on his thigh, its beam angled down at the ground, illuminating a small patch of leaves and a single pale mushroom that had forced its way up through the litter, its fragile cap beaded with water, an odd little insistence of life in a night that seemed otherwise dedicated to erasing distinctions. He thought of Annie again, not as an abstract reason to survive or a symbol of his responsibilities, but as a small concrete person who had that morning stood in the kitchen with a butter knife and an open jar of peanut butter, carefully smearing a thick, uneven layer onto bread for his sandwich, tongue poking out the corner of her mouth with concentration, her hair a mess, because they had been running late. She had wrapped the sandwich in foil with too much of the shiny metal gathered at one end, the way kids did when they hadn't quite learned how to fold evenly, and she had dropped it into his bag with a proud little flourish, as if she were handing him something that would carry him safely through the day. He realized with a sudden tight ache that he had eaten that sandwich without thinking somewhere near the halfway mark of his outbound run, the flavors already faded from memory, and that if something happened to him out here, that small morning ritual would be the last uncomplicated moment they'd shared. A simple act of care overshadowed by a night neither of them could have imagined when the alarm went off at 5. The thought did something to him that all the calculations and route planning had not. It made the stakes of his return feel painfully intimate, separate from any sense of professional duty or abstract morality. It wasn't just about being the man who got a busload of strangers out of a bad situation anymore. It was about not leaving that kitchen table chair empty in a way that could never be explained to an 8-year-old in terms of slope stability and rainfall and company policy. He let that feeling sit in his chest for a moment, heavy and hot and almost unbearable, and then he made a decision that was less about geography and more about refusing to let fear be the thing that defined his next move. He was not going to die on this log in this patch of woods with his world shrunk to a wet mushroom and a circle of flashlight. If the mountain was going to take him, it would not be because he sat down and let his mind chew itself into paralysis. He shifted his weight to stand, and that was when the ground betrayed him, not dramatically, not with a cinematic crack and slide, but in a small, treacherous way that was almost worse. His right foot, planted on what he thought was solid, leaf-covered earth, found instead the disguised edge of a narrow hole where water had undercut the soil beneath, leaving a thin crust that collapsed under his weight. His leg plunged down into the void up to the knee, his body tipped sideways, and he flung out his left hand to break the fall, the flashlight skittering from his thigh, and bouncing once before coming to rest at an angle that sent its beam spearing off into the undergrowth. Pain exploded in his hand as it struck rock hidden under the leaves, a bright white hot jolt that shot up his arm and turned the edges of his vision gray for a heartbeat. He tasted copper and realized he had bitten his tongue. For a moment he lay half-twisted, one leg trapped, one arm stretched out, breath knocked thin by the shock, the wet chill of the ground soaking into his side, the smell of crushed vegetation and fresh, turned earth filling his nose. He cursed under his breath, not with the creative, throwing blame kind of swearing he'd sometimes indulged in traffic, but with a raw, involuntary sound that acknowledged the pain and the stupidity of the fall in equal measure. He pulled his foot free with a wet sucking noise, feeling mud smear up his calf inside the boot, and rolled onto his back, staring up through the lattice of branches at a sky that was only a slightly lighter shade of black than the forest itself. His hand throbbed in time with his heartbeat, each pulse sending a new wave of pain through the palm and fingers, and when he lifted it into the flashlight's beam, retrieved awkwardly with his other hand, he saw that the skin across the base of his thumb and along the heel of his palm was torn in a jagged line, already welling blood that mixed with the rainwater to form thin pink streaks that ran down his wrist and disappeared into the cuff of Karlov's coat. He flexed his fingers carefully, relieved to find that they responded, stiff but functional, no grinding or sharp internal pains to suggest broken bone, just the deep bruised ache of soft tissue that had taken more impact than it was designed for. It would hurt to grip anything, to hold the flashlight, to grab branches for balance, but it would not stop him from doing those things. In a strange way, the pain helped because it dragged him firmly back into his body, away from the looping abstract fears that had been threatening to swallow him. It was a concrete problem with a clear dimension and a familiar set of responses. He tore a strip from the inside lining of his own jacket beneath Karlov's coat, the fabric giving way with a reluctant rip, and wrapped it clumsily around his palm, using his teeth to help tighten the knot. The makeshift bandage soaked almost immediately, but at least it held the skin together and kept the worst of the dirt out, and the simple act of doing something practical, however small, steadied him more than any amount of deep breathing might have. He lay there for another few seconds, feeling his pulse slow from a wild gallop to a hard, steady trot, and as he stared up, he noticed a change in the texture of the sky between the branches. The clouds, which had been a uniform, low ceiling of black, seemed thinner directly above him, streaked with a faint smoky gray that suggested altitude, and then, almost as if the mountain were offering a begrudging consolation prize for the fall, the clouds parted in a narrow, ragged tear. Through that slit, cold and distant and astonishingly clear, a single star showed itself, faint but unmistakable against the darker backdrop. For a few heartbeats, he could not place it, could not fit that pinprick of light into any of the diagrams he half remembered from school nights and childhood camping trips, and then his brain caught up, recognizing the way it sat in relation to the faint hint of a larger, ghostly shape nearby. He realized he was looking at the North Star, not because he had some seasoned woodsman's expertise, but because he had traced that particular pattern with Annie on her bedroom ceiling, finger following plastic glow points as they lay in the dark, and made up stories about sailors and travelers and people who needed to find their way home. The coincidence, or whatever it was, that he happened to be lying on his back in a random patch of Appalachian forest, post-fall, with a gap in the cloud cover positioned just so, might have seemed cheap in a different context. But here, soaked and hurting and frayed, it felt less like a narrative convenience, and more like a small stubborn alignment of things that did not have to line up, but did anyway. He knew better than to put too much faith in the star's exact position, not with the clouds already closing in again at the edges of that narrow window, but it gave him something his own spinning thoughts had not, a fixed point beyond himself, beyond the immediate reach of rain and branches and fear. Something that had nothing to do with the bus or the mountain or his past mistakes, and yet could still serve as a reference for the direction he needed to go. He rolled onto his side with a grunt, pushed himself up slowly, favoring his injured hand, and oriented his body, so that the fading glimmer of the stars sat where north belonged in his mental map, then turned carefully to place valley, where it should be in relation to that. It was rough navigation, the kind his father would have insisted needed backup from landmarks and contour lines, but it was something, and, more importantly, it was a decision made from a place that felt less like blind panic, and more like the stubborn refusal to let panic be the only voice in the room. As he stood there, adjusting the strap of the flashlight so his injured hand could rest a little, he became aware of another sound layered under the rain in the distant creek, so soft at first that he thought it was an extension of his own breathing. But as he held himself still and let his ears reach out, he realized it was separate, coming not from his body, but from the darkness around him. It was the faintest suggestion of movement, a series of small deliberate footfalls spaced evenly apart, too heavy to be falling leaves, too controlled to be random branches dropping water, circling the edges of his hearing without committing to a clear direction, like something pacing just beyond the reach of his light, content for the moment to let him know only that was no longer the only moving thing in this patch of woods. He stood very still, the way he had stood once at the back of a depot garage when a loaded pallet had begun to tilt on a forklift, every muscle locked not in paralysis, but in the held tension of someone who knows that the next move, whether his or the world's, will define the rest of the sequence, and as he held his breath, the soft footfalls continued around him, spaced with the kind of unhurried regularity that did not belong to a lone deer crashing blindly through underbrush or to wind knocking loose a cascade of branches, but to something that understood its own weight and the way to place it. The rain had thinned to a mist during the last stretch of his stumble and recovery, and in that damp hush the individual sounds of the forest separated more cleanly. He could hear the drip of collected water falling from leaf to leaf, the distant low roar of the swollen creek, the occasional crack of a settling limb, but above and between those, like a thread pulled through a complex weave, were the steps' soft padded impacts on wet leaves and soil, never too close, never too far, circling him with the measured patience of something taking his measure. His heart, which had just begun to climb down from the steep spike of the fall, surged again, but this time the fear felt different, where the panic of being lost had been diffuse and almost abstract, a smear of possibilities and what-ifs. This was sharp and ancient, cutting straight past the layers of training and reason to the part of him that recognized the pattern of being watched by eyes that belonged to a predator, a recognition older than buses and routes and performance reviews. Older even than the stories his father had told by the flicker of a campfire. He had read enough in news articles and scattered pamphlets at trailheads to know that real wolves, the few that might remain in these mountains in a time when most of their kind had been pushed north and west or into ghost stories, did not seek out humans as prey, that they were shy and wary and far more likely to avoid confrontation, and he clung to that knowledge, as if it were a physical object he could hold between himself and the dark, even as another part of his mind calmly pointed out that whatever was pacing out there was not avoiding him, it was drawing a deliberate ring. He turned slowly, raising the flashlight with his good hand, the beam cutting through the trunks in a wide, pale sweep that made the wet bark gleam and set 1,000 tiny droplets sparkling like scattered glass. And for a moment the forest looked almost beautiful, transformed from an oppressive wall of black into a cathedral of damp wood and glistening leaves. Then the light slid over a shape at the edge of its reach, and his breath stopped in his throat. At the very margin of the beam, just inside the line where the undergrowth thickened, a pair of eyes caught the light and reflected it back in a flat greenish glow, not blinking, not flinching away, set in a head held low and forward, ears pricked. For a second, the rest of the animal was only suggestion, a darker shadow. Against the dark, a hint of shoulders, the faint trace of breath steaming in the cool air, but as his eyes adjusted, he could make out the long muzzle, the thick wet fur lying close against a lean body, the way the forelegs were braced apart not in a crouch ready to spring, but in a stance that was almost casual, the casualness of a thing that did not feel it needed to prove anything yet. He might have convinced himself it was a large dog, some stray or hunting animal gone off course, if not for the fact that when he shifted the beam slightly, the light picked up not one pair of those flat reflective eyes, but 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, spaced at different points around the circle of trees, each set at roughly the same height off the ground, each attached to a body that held itself with the coiled ease of a creature meant for covering distance and closing gaps. A ring of wolves, or coy-wolves, or some other hybrid born of long pressure and adaptation, labels did not matter here. What mattered was that he was standing in the center of a loose, intentional formation of 5 wild canids that had chosen, in this saturated narrow slice of Appalachian night, to put him at the topic of their collective attention. A part of his mind, the one that had once flipped through a wilderness safety brochure in a doctor's waiting room, offered up a list of instructions in a dry monotone: do not run, do not turn your back, make yourself look larger, speak firmly, throw things if they approach, but those guidelines had been written for campsites and trail encounters in broad daylight. Not for the strange suspended moment he found himself in now, where the animals were neither advancing nor retreating, simply holding position as if waiting to see what the man in the middle would do now that the circle had closed. He swallowed the inside of his mouth, suddenly so dry it felt like cotton despite the wet air, and forced himself to think not of fangs and lunges, but of behavior, of the few facts he could recall beyond the lurid folk tales. Packs hunted deer and other ungulates, animals that bolted and ran and had to be separated from the herd, and they did so with strategy, using flanks and feints in terrain. They did not, as a rule, hurl themselves at bipedal creatures who stood their ground and made noise. If anything, they found humans troubling enough to avoid when possible. Okay, he said, and his voice sounded strange in his own ears, rough and too deep, as if it belonged to a different man. He did not raise it to a shout that felt wrong in this compressed space, as if screaming would only splinter his own shaky calm, and send it skittering into the underbrush, but he made it firm and steady, the way he might address an agitated passenger whose anger he could not indulge. You've made your point. The nearest wolf, the one directly ahead of him, did not flinch at the sound, but its ears twitched, and he saw, in the way its weight shifted minutely from one forepaw to the other, that it had heard him and registered that the object in the center of the ring was not simply a moving thing, but a speaking one. Its fur, dark gray mottled with lighter streaks that caught occasional fragments of the flashlight beam, lay slick against a body that looked lean more than gaunt, built for distance rather than sheer power, and its tail hung not rigidly out in threat but relaxed, a line with a subtle downward curve. He slowly began to pivot in place, keeping his upper body squared to the wolf ahead, while his feet described a careful half circle, the flashlight beam sliding from one pair of eyes to the next, confirming that there were indeed 5 animals, spaced with the kind of rough symmetry that suggested this position was no accident. They were not equidistant, not a perfect geometric arrangement, but they had covered enough angles that if he chose a direction at random and tried to charge through, he would be within a few bounds of at least one of them. They did not growl, did not bare their teeth or crouch, they simply watched, their heads tracking his movements with a smoothness that made him think of radar dishes swiveling, each adjusting slightly as he turned, so that 1 or 2 sets of eyes always remained in the direct line of his gaze and light. The silence of their mouths, the lack of overt threat display, unnerved him more than a show of aggression might have, because it suggested a level of evaluation and patience he could not predict. The ancient fear in his blood told him to back away slowly, to try to increase the distance between himself and those eyes by any means. But another part, the one that had spent years reading the flows of traffic and predicting the unhappy chain reactions certain moves would cause, recognized that retreat here would not mean safety, it would mean ceding initiative, presenting flanks and back, inviting them to adjust the circle without the constraint of his watching face. Instead, he angled his shoulders slightly toward the other side of the clearing, where, if his battered sense of orientation was roughly accurate, the land should fall away toward the valley, where pine woods slept under the same rain, unaware of the driver inching toward it through a ring of ancestral stories. As he did, he saw something he had not noticed at first, a subtle difference in the way one of the animals carried itself compared to the others. The wolf, standing a half step forward of the one ahead and to his right, was larger than the rest, not dramatically, not in the way a dog might tower over a terrier, but with a presence that filled more space despite the uniformity of posture. Its shoulders looked heavier, the chest broader, the fur thicker around the neck, and its head sat a fraction higher, muzzle level rather than angled, as if it were accustomed to being able to see over the backs of its companions. Most striking, though, in the shifting wash of flashlight and shadow, was the ragged notch in its right ear, a torn crescent missing from the outer edge, healed but unmistakable, a scar that marked it in a way no human name could. It stood in front, not at the exact center of the ring, but in a position where, if he were to draw lines between the 5 animals, it would be at the shallow leading curve of a crescent, with the others forming a rough arc behind and beside it, their bodies angled subtly toward its flanks as if ready to move with it should it choose a direction. The realization that he was looking at a leader, not in some romanticized fairy tale sense, but in the simple, practical hierarchy of a group of predators, sent a fresh chill through him, because it meant that whatever happened next would likely be decided not by some random individual lunge, but by this animal's choice. He kept his gaze on that torn ear, on the steady, unblinking eyes below it, and fought to keep his own breathing measured, knowing that while animals could smell fear in the chemical sense, they could also read it in the way bodies moved, the way weight shifted, the way eyes darted. He thought, not entirely rationally, that if he could hold himself together enough to project something other than prey, something between threat and fellow traveler, he might avoid triggering whatever pattern of behavior the sight of running, flailing things woke in their brains. The idea of speaking again, maybe even calling out to them in some foolish attempt at making contact, flickered through him and dissipated. These were not dogs in a backyard to be coaxed with soft names, and any sound he made would be for his benefit, not theirs. He decided instead on a different kind of communication, movement, and, taking a breath that felt like it scraped the inside of his ribs, he took one slow step toward the side of the clearing. That would move him not directly at the largest wolf, but toward a gap between it and its neighbor. The reaction was immediate and synchronous, choreographed in a way that made his stomach clench. The two wolves closest to that gap flowed forward a pace, closing it without altering their calm posture, their eyes never leaving him. The big one with the torn ear did not move, but he saw its muscles tighten fractionally along the shoulders, a preparation, and in that slight adjustment, he understood that if he pushed that line hard, he would meet something far less patient. He shifted then, angling his body instead toward the opposite side, where the trees seemed marginally thinner, where he thought he could see the faint lighter smear of a clearer path behind them. Just as before, the wolves guarding that segment of the ring responded, stepping in with smooth precision, forming a living wall that did not snarl or snap, but simply existed as an undeniable barrier. He realized, with a mix of awe and dread, that he was experiencing, in real time, the same kind of coordinated positioning that deer and elk did when packs began to shape their options on open slopes. Only here he was the single object in the center, and the outcome was not yet clear. His rational mind, valiantly soldiering on under layers of adrenaline, whispered that this behavior did not entirely match the patterns of a group intent on immediate attack. If they had wanted to rush him, they could have done so in the first 10 seconds, overwhelming him in a flurry of fur and teeth before he could even get the flashlight up. Instead, they were controlling his movement, preventing him from blundering in one particular direction. The question that rose, strange and almost laughable in its audacity, was whether they were keeping him from something worse. It was an idea that would have seemed insane in a well-lit kitchen, but here, with the memory of the collapsed shoulder on the road, of the hidden void that had swallowed his leg, of the creek's swollen roar echoing in ways that had already fooled him, he could not entirely dismiss the possibility that the direction he was trying to move toward led to a sudden drop. A slick, unseen cliff edge, or a ravine he had not yet detected, and that these wolves, whose territory this was in a way no map could capture, knew the shape of the land better than he did. The concept of predators acting not as agents of harm, but as reluctant guides felt like some half-remembered myth, the kind of story old Ruth might know in another life, told in quiet kitchens about haints and hounds and animals that walked between worlds. Yet the immediate physical reality in front of him was that when he edged toward places that made sense to his tired human brain, the wolves stepped in, and when he shifted toward one particular slice of trees off to his left, the arc seemed to relax by a fraction, as if a door he had not been able to see had cracked open there. He tested it carefully, moving his weight in that direction with the same caution he might use in lane changing on a highway crowded with trucks. A smooth, gradual shift, no sudden jerks. The wolves watched, of course, their heads tracked him, and one or two adjusted their paws, but the coordinated step forward that had blocked his other attempts did not come. The big one with the torn ear lifted its head a fraction, gaze flicking from him to that patch of forest and back again, and there was something in the look, a kind of appraising patience that he might have called invitation, if he had been in any mood to interpret wolf eyes through the lens of human metaphors. He did not fully trust what he thought he was seeing. He knew enough about human pattern, seeking to recognize that in a situation where nothing made obvious sense, the brain would gladly glue coincidence into meaning and call it guidance just to ease the ache of uncertainty. Yet he also knew that standing frozen in the center of this living ring, waiting for some undeniable sign, would get him no closer to the valley or the bus, and that the mountain's slow, patient erosion was not the only clock running now. There was also his battery, his stamina, the temperature dropping by degrees as the night wore on. He looked at the torn ear again, at the wet fur darkened almost to black where the rain had soaked it, at the steady eyes that did not waver under his light, and he made another decision that would have made no sense at noon on a clear day, but felt, in this moment, like the only one that did. He chose to act as if the wolves were not simply hemming him in, but shaping his route, and he stepped, slowly and deliberately, toward the gap they seemed less intent on closing. As he moved, the circle shifted with him, not collapsing, not tightening aggressively, but flowing, the animals pacing to maintain a rough equidistance, while allowing his line of travel to tilt toward that particular stretch of trees. It felt like walking in the center of a moving diagram, a living illustration of concepts he had only ever seen rendered in nature documentaries, flanking, funneling, channeled motion, except that here, the endpoint was not a panicked ungulate stumbling into a kill zone, but him, a man in a soaked borrowed coat. Following a path suggested by the bodies of creatures every story had taught him to fear. The big wolf with the torn ear turned first, breaking the stillness it had held since he noticed it, and padded away through the undergrowth in that same direction, not in a rush, not in a stealthy slink, but in a steady ground-eating lope, glancing back once over its shoulder as if to make sure he was tracking. The others held their positions around him for a heartbeat longer, then, as if touched by some signal too subtle for his senses, they peeled away as well, melting into the trees on either side, some staying behind him at a short distance, others drifting parallel, like a loose escort. He could have stayed where he was, watched them go, told himself that the tension of the moment had broken, and that their departure meant he was free to reassert his own plan, to march off in whatever direction his imperfect compass suggested. But the sight of that ragged ear disappearing between the trunks pulled at something in him that was not entirely rational. It felt, in an odd, deep way, like being offered a hand across a stream by someone you did not know and had no reason to trust, except that the alternative was to wade into water you suspected was deeper and faster than it looked. Fine, he murmured, more to himself than to them, his voice just loud enough to be swallowed by the damp air. Let's see where you're going. He stepped forward, following the line the big wolf had taken, the flashlight beam bobbing over the same wet ground, the same roots and stones, but now his awareness included the soft, almost soundless presence of padded feet somewhere ahead and behind and to the side, the pack's formation adjusting as the terrain changed. The fear did not disappear. It rode with him, a constant prickling awareness that he was walking among predators with jaws strong enough to snap bone, that a change in their decision about him could turn this cautious procession into something much shorter and bloodier, but alongside that fear, something else had begun to grow, a strange tentative thread of trust, not in their intentions, which he could not know, but in their knowledge of this night, wet, treacherous land. Each time he drifted unconsciously toward a faint downward slope that looked faster, easier, the wolves on that side would move a shade closer, bodies angled in a way that nudged him back toward the line the big one was taking. And when he, testing the pattern, veered intentionally toward a darker patch where the underbrush looked thicker, the faint clatter of dislodged rock and the far-off, echoing rush of unseen water answered his move a split second after the nearest animal's ears had already flicked in that direction, as if they had known what lay there before sound confirmed it. He followed then, not in the blind, slack-jawed way of someone surrendering entirely to another will, but in the wary alert attention of a man who has decided, for this narrow slice of time, to let his own insistence on control relax enough to accommodate another logic, one older than his route maps and his cautionary tales. As he walked, pain pulsed in his bandaged hand, the damp fabric tight against torn skin, a reminder of his body's breakability and resilience at once, and overhead the clouds had sealed again, hiding the star that had given him his last fixed point. His new reference was moving on four legs through the trees, a ragged ear cutting a small notch in the outline of a wet het every time it turned to glance back, and he found, to his surprise, that the idea did not terrify him as much as it should have. In a night where the road had given way and his own sense of direction had bent into circles, it almost made sense that the thing he would have feared most under other circumstances would become, for now, the only thing that seemed to know exactly where it was going. For the first few minutes, every step he took behind the torn-eared wolf felt like a conscious act of defiance against a lifetime of inherited stories and cautionary tales, as though with each placement of his boot, he were stepping on a brittle sheet of thin ice labeled common sense, waiting for the moment when it would crack and drop him into the cold rational truth. That trusting a pack of wild predators in the middle of a storm-black forest was nothing more than fear dressed up as faith. Yet the crack never came, and instead something else began to happen, slow and almost imperceptible at first, like a muscle unclenching, after having been tight for so long it had forgotten any other state. The wolves led at a pace that was neither hurried nor leisurely, a ground-covering lope that ate distance without burning energy, and he found that matching it required him to adjust the way he moved through the woods. Instead of stopping every few yards to reassess and reorient, he had to commit to a rhythm, to trust that the line they were taking would not suddenly veer into a tangle of impenetrable undergrowth or a blind drop, and as he did, the constant, staccato barrage of micro decisions that had filled his head since he left the bus eased back, leaving room in his mind for other thoughts to surface. He noticed, for example, the way the forest around them changed almost without him realizing it. The dense thickets of rhododendron and low shrubs, thinning out into stands of older, taller trees whose branches began higher off the ground, creating a kind of vaulted space beneath the canopy where he could see 10, sometimes 15 yards ahead between the trunks, a distance that felt almost luxurious after the earlier claustrophobia. The ground underfoot shifted to the slick, treacherous patchwork of exposed clay and leaf-choked hollows, giving way in places to a carpet of pine needles that muffled their combined footsteps and provided a firmer, more forgiving surface for his tired legs. The rain had eased to a fine, steady mist that hung in the air like a veil, catching the beam of his flashlight in 1,000 tiny points, but much of it was caught by the dense branches above, so that only the occasional fat drop fell directly onto his face or the back of his neck, cold enough to make him flinch, but not enough to soak him further. The smells changed with the terrain, too, where before there had been the heavy, almost metallic tang of saturated soil and the sharp, dank scent of rotting leaves. Now there was more resin in the air, the clean, slightly medicinal aroma of wet pine sap, undercut by the musky, unmistakable odor of the wolves themselves, damp fur, animal sweat, the faint, rank note of bodies that lived outdoors in all weathers. Every so often, the torn-eared wolf at the front would pause at some feature he could not immediately see: a narrow, half-hidden ditch, a fallen tree trunk slick with moss, a patch of ground where the angle shifted abruptly, and glance back over its shoulder, the reflected glint of its eyes briefly catching the beam of his light, as if checking that he was still there and, by extension, that he was paying attention, and then it would move again, adjusting its lines slightly to take them around or over whatever obstacle lay ahead with the least wasted effort. When they reached a shallow, fast-running stream, one of the many small veins feeding the louder creek he had been following by sound, he saw, in the careful way the wolves crossed, how intimate their knowledge of this land was. They did not plow straight through at the nearest point, but angled upstream a few yards, choosing a place where the stones beneath the water, barely visible as darker bulges under the rippling surface, formed a rough chain of islands. The torn-eared wolf stepped lightly from one to the next, its paws finding purchase on the slick rock with unhurried confidence, and the others followed in its exact footprints, the pack's line a precise, almost ceremonial procession. When his turn came, he stepped where they had stepped, feeling with his boots for the rougher textures under the water where the moss was anchored more firmly, using the flashlight beam to pick out the subtle differences in color between deeper pools and shallower crossings. And though the cold seeped up through the soles and numbed his toes, he made it across without slipping. A small victory that meant more to him than the distance covered, because it felt like proof that this strange, temporary alignment of man and animals could, at least in this moment, work. His injured hand pulsed with each movement, the damp makeshift bandage tight against the swollen palm, and from time to time he would switch the flashlight to his other hand to give it a brief rest, the wolf's sense seeming stronger whenever the light dipped closer to the ground. The pain, instead of fraying his focus, anchored it. Every throb reminded him that he was still here in this body, that his fears and decisions were happening in a real physical context, not in some abstract narrative that might be reset if he simply woke up. The constant high-pitched buzz of panic that had underpinned his thoughts earlier had receded to something lower, a background hum that did not go away, but no longer drowned out everything else, and in that relative quiet, he found room to consider, with a kind of tired curiosity, how he had arrived at this point in his life, where following a wild animal through a storm-dark forest felt less reckless than trusting his own path. 8 years of carrying the memory of that first landslide, of the way he had been punished for making the right call at the wrong time, had worn grooves in his sense of judgment, carving channels where doubt and second-guessing flowed easily, and tonight, the mountain had widened those channels into ravines. He realized with a small startling jolt that what he was experiencing now was something he had not allowed himself since that first firing, the act of trusting his gut without immediately subjecting it to a tribunal of imagined supervisors and post-mortem reports. He had made the call to leave the road, to choose the forest over the asphalt, to keep walking after discovering his loop, to follow the wolves instead of trying to outmaneuver them. And if those decisions turned out to be wrong, there would be no committee convened to distribute blame. There would only be consequences, final and indifferent. Somehow, stripped of bureaucratic judgment, the stakes felt cleaner, if not less terrifying. They stopped once at a small clearing where a dead tree had fallen long enough ago that its trunk was half mired in the soil, its bark sloughed off to reveal pale water-stained wood beneath. The torn-eared wolf trotted to the edge of a narrow, dark band of water that cut across the clearing, a deeper drainage channel, perhaps, or just a place where the ground had sagged and lowered its head to drink, lapping quickly, ears flicking at the small sounds of the night. The others scattered slightly, some circling outward to stand watch, heads high, nostrils flaring, others flopping down for a moment in the wet leaves, their tongues hanging out as they panted lightly, steam rising from their bodies in thin, ghostly wisps. Alex realized only then how hard he had been pushing himself to keep up with their pace. His lungs burned mildly, his thighs ached with a deep, steady fatigue that promised rebellion if he ignored it much longer, and his feet felt like blocks of wet wood in sight, his boots. He used the pause to lean against a tree, the rough bark scraping pleasantly against his back, and tilted his head back to see if the sky had cracked open again, offering another glimpse of anything beyond the low uniform gray of cloud, but the canopy above was a solid dripping ceiling, impenetrable and heavy. He unscrewed the cap of the small water bottle he had clipped to his belt, a habit from years of knowing that depots did not always have working fountains, and that gas stations closed early on rural routes, and took a careful sip, the cool liquid washing the taste of fear and copper and wet bark from his mouth. It seemed absurd, in a quietly comic way, to be sharing this moment with a pack of wolves who were quenching their thirst from a murky runoff channel, their bodies entirely adapted to whatever bacteria the mountain threw at them, while he, product of urban tap water and chlorinated pools, rationed his filtered ounces like a hoarder. He watched the torn-eared wolf as it drank, noting details now that the edge of immediate fear had dulled slightly. The way the fur around its neck was thicker and slightly lighter than the rest, forming a kind of ruff, the faint ribs visible when it breathed deeply, indicating a lean but not starving frame, the pattern of old scars around its muzzle. Thin lines of slightly puckered skin where fur grew at odd angles, like memories of past encounters written in a language of flesh. As it lifted its head, a small metallic glint around its neck caught the angle of his flashlight beam, and for a moment he thought it was just a trick of wet fur reflecting light. But then the shape resolved into something too regular to be natural, a narrow band of discolored rust-streaked material, half buried under the wolf's thick coat. He stepped, without thinking, half a pace closer, raising the light to get a better look, and one of the wolves behind him emitted a low warning rumble, a sound that vibrated through his spine, more than it reached his ears. He stopped immediately, palms open at his sides, a placating gesture more for himself than for them, and angled the beam instead, careful not to shine it directly into the torn-eared wolf's eyes. The light slit along the curve of its neck and picked out the edge of a collar, or what had once been a collar, a strip of cracked, weathered leather, its original color indeterminate under the coat of grime and rust, with a small misshapen loop of metal where a tag might once have hung. The thing sat so deeply embedded in the fur that in places the hair had grown around it, swallowing its outline, and he could see, where the leather cut into the wolf's skin at the throat, a faint permanent groove, as if over the years the animal's body had reshaped itself to accommodate this foreign band. It was an artifact from another life, a mute testament that this creature had, at some point, lived close enough to humans to have been collared, perhaps as a pup in someone's yard or as a working animal on some backwoods property, before time and circumstance had dragged it back into the wild and left this thin decaying circle as a mark of that half-buried crossing. The sight of it shifted something inside him in a way he had not anticipated. The wolf, which had until now been an embodiment of otherness, of wild logic, suddenly appeared tethered to the world of driveways and porches and back steps in a way he understood painfully well. It did not make the animal safer, did not turn it into a dog in any meaningful sense, but it did complicate the story his mind had been telling him about the strict divide between domesticated order and the indifferent predatory forest. Here was a creature that had moved between those worlds, carrying a piece of one into the other, not because of some mythic destiny, but because people somewhere had once thought they could own its direction and had been proven wrong. He wondered with a kind of grim, tired humor whether he was any different in this moment, tramping through the dark behind of being shaped by both human and non-human forces. His own invisible collar that had been the bus schedule and the rules and the fear of reprimand, now tugged loose by the mountain's blunt insistence that none of that mattered here. For the first time since he had stepped off the asphalt, he felt something like kinship with another presence in this night, not in the sense of shared species or fate, but in the recognition that both of them were, in their own ways, creatures who had once been constrained by a smaller, more predictable world, and had been pushed out of it into a larger, harsher one they had not chosen. The torn-eared wolf finished drinking and shook its head once, sending a spray of water droplets out in a small glittering arc that caught the edge of the flashlight beam. Then it turned, flicked him a brief unreadable look, and began to move again, slipping between the trees with that same economical grace, its shoulders rolling lightly under the wet fur. The others rose, shaking out their coats, and fell into place around and behind him, the formation reforming with the ease of long practice, and he found himself stepping away from the tree and following almost before he consciously decided to, feeling, for a passing disorienting second, like a link in a chain rather than a solitary flailing point. As they went on, the sound of the creek slowly grew clearer, resolving out of the background murmur of the rain and the forest into a distinct rushing presence, and he realized that they were angling not directly toward it, but along a contour that kept it at a more or less constant distance below them, as if they were walking the side of a broad shallow bowl, rather than dropping straight down into its center. That pattern, too, felt intentional. Any idiot could stumble downhill toward water, but it took a different kind of familiarity to skirt the edges of flood-swollen channels, without blundering into washouts or hidden banks softened by the day's rain. His mind, freed up by the fact that someone else, something else was handling the micronavigation, began to wander down paths of its own, not all of them pleasant. He thought again of the bus, of the people inside it, of how they would be sitting now, perhaps quieter than before, the adrenaline of the initial shock burned off and replaced by the heavier, more corrosive exhaustion that came from waiting for something you could not control. and he tried to picture their faces as they had looked when he left the tight worry in Marina's, the forced bravado in Karlov's, the blank calm in Old Roof's, and he wondered what version of him they were imagining now, out here in the dark. He suspected that for some of them he had already become more story than person, a figure moving through the forest in their minds with an ease that did not match the reality of his slow stumbling progress. It was easier that way, he knew, when you were trapped. You wanted to believe that whoever went to get help was competent in ways that bordered on the mythical, because the alternative that the person you had pinned your hopes on was just as scared and fallible as you was too much to sit with. He did not know whether that made what he was doing more or less cruel, but he knew that either way, the only way to narrow the distance between their imagined version and the real one was to keep following this strange living compass until the trees broke and lights appeared. His phone, when he checked it briefly, glowed up at him with a battery icon that had shrunk to a sliver, the numbers next to the little symbol reading 14%, and the time 12:11 a.m., staking out the night's slow progression with mechanical indifference. He turned it off again to save what remained, deciding that any potential moment of coverage would be more valuable closer to Pinewood, where the faint halo of cell towers might reach into the valley, than here under the dense canopy, where even the sky could barely penetrate. The wolves did not care about his battery, about minutes or percentages. Their world was divided differently in measures of scent and hunger and territory, and the sharp immediate now of each step. Yet as they moved, he sensed in them something that was not quite urgency, but also not the lazy meandering of animals out for a casual patrol. They had a destination in mind, even if he could not see it yet, and they were going there with a steadiness that made his earlier circling in the woods feel, in retrospect, like a child's game. After what could have been 20 minutes or an hour time had lost its sharp edges somewhere back at the fallen log, the texture of the air changed subtly around him. It became less dense, less saturated with the smell of enclosed rain-washed wood, and carried instead a faint, almost domestic scent, a thread of smoke, thin but unmistakable, winding its way through the damp, the smell of wood that had been cut and burned in a controlled way, rather than fallen and rotted where it lay. The effect on him was immediate and visceral. His chest tightened, and for a moment he thought it was another wave of panic, but then he recognized that the feeling was something closer to hope, that dangerous, sharp-edged thing that could cut as easily as it could lift. Smoke meant people, or at least the recent presence of people. It meant chimneys and stoves and hands that had stacked logs and struck matches. And for the first time since he had stepped into the forest, the idea of Pinewood resolved into something more concrete than a series of lines on a mental map. The torn-eared wolf's ears flicked, too, and it quickened its pace almost imperceptibly, the muscles in its haunches working with a touch more energy, as if this scent was part of the pattern it had been moving toward all along. The others adjusted without obvious signals, the pack's formation tightening for a few strides, then loosening again as they threaded their way between the trees. And Alex, catching that slight increase in momentum, felt his own legs respond in kind, the ache in his thighs and calves receding behind the forward pull. He did not let himself imagine porch lights yet, or the crunch of gravel under a truck's tires, or the startled sleepy face of some man in a flannel shirt opening a door to find a soaked stranger, and a story that sounded like an exaggeration. Those images hovered just out of reach, like the memory of the North Star behind the clouds, and he knew better than to grab for them too soon for fear of ripping them. Instead, he kept his eyes on the line of the torn-eared wolf's back as it moved ahead of him, the collar around its neck glinting dully when the flashlight beam caught it, a thin rusted circle marking it as something that had once been claimed and then lost, and he walked behind it into the deepening smell of smoke, thinking that if the mountain had decided to send him a guide, it had chosen one that knew more than most about the complicated roots between being owned and being free. He smelled the village before he saw it, the thin ribbon of wood smoke that had teased the edge of his awareness thickening into something more textured as they moved, acquiring undernotes of cooking fat and damp ash, and that peculiar, slightly acrid scent that clings to clothes and curtains in houses where the stove does as much work as the furnace. And with each breath that pulled those notes into his lungs, the abstract idea of pine wood dots on a map, a line on a dispatch sheet gathered weight, turned into a cluster of actual houses containing actual people who, at this very moment, were almost certainly asleep, oblivious to the fact that a man and a small constellation of wolves were threading their way toward them through the wet trees. The ground under his boots flattened gradually, the long, careful sideways traverse along the slope, easing into something that felt more like the bottom of a broad, shallow bowl than the side of it, and the sound of the creek dropped away behind them, muffled by the curve of earth. In its place rose other, subtler noises somewhere ahead and a little to the right, the faint hum of a transformer, a steady, almost comforting electrical thrum, distinct from any natural sound he had heard all night, the distant clank of metal against metal, irregular and muted as if echoing through walls, the ghost of music, maybe, or the low murmur of a television left on for company. The trees thinned almost without him noticing, the dense ranks of trunks giving way to individual stems with wider gaps between them, patches of open sky showing as irregular patches of lighter gray overhead. And then, with the abruptness of a curtain being pulled back, he stepped out of the last line of trees and found himself at the edge of a clearing. That was not a clearing at all, but a yard. It took him a second to understand what he was seeing, partly because his eyes, used to parsing variations of black and wet green, recoiled at the sudden presence of rectangles and straight lines, and partly because there was something inherently surreal about the way this small piece of human order sat so matter-of-factly at the boundary of the wild he had just traversed. A single-story house squatted 20 yards away, its roof line low and simple, metal shingles glistening with moisture. A wide front porch ran the length of the facade, its railings sagging slightly in the middle from years of leaning elbows and the weight of potted plants. Two rocking chairs positioned beside the front door, as if waiting for their occupants to return from somewhere just out of sight. The porch light was off, but a weak rectangle of yellow seeped from a window to the right of the door, painting a smear of diluted color onto the wet-packed dirt driveway, where an older pickup truck sat with its nose pointed toward the road, its sides streaked with mud up to the wheel wells. The truck's bed held a jumble of tools, a coil of rope, and what looked like the rusted frame of an old lawn chair. Beyond it, barely visible in the limited spill of light, he could make out the shapes of other houses, one with a metal carport attached, another with a satellite dish perched precariously on its roof, all of them turned inward toward the narrow gravel lane that cut through the village like a shallow stream. The sudden domestication of space hit him almost as hard as the first sight of the wolves had, though in a different register, his body, primed for the constant diffused threat of uneven ground and unseen drops in animal movement, now had to account for porch steps, low fences, coiled garden hoses, the possibility of a dog chained somewhere just out of sight. That might erupt into noise at his approach, waking half the valley. It was as if he had stepped through some invisible membrane and now stood in a place where the rules he had just spent an hour adapting to no longer applied cleanly, replaced instead by the subtler, more complicated codes of property lines and late-night knocking, and the delicate balance between the suspicion and hospitality of small towns. He became aware, suddenly, that the night around him had changed in another way as he crossed that boundary. The wolves had stopped. He turned his head and saw them standing at the very edge of the trees, bodies half in shadow, half illuminated by the faint spill from the house window. The torn-eared wolf was slightly ahead of the others, paws planted firmly on the damp leaf litter, eyes fixed on him with a stare that, absent the forest's suffocating closeness, felt different, no less intense, but framed now by the clear demarcation between their world and his. For a long suspended heartbeat, they regarded one another across that narrow strip of transitional ground. He thought of the collar under the torn fur, of the way the animal had navigated slopes and gullies and hidden streams with such unerring precision, and he felt, rising in his chest, an urge to say something out loud that would acknowledge the fact that, whether by instinct or some quieter, older arrangement of things, they had brought him here, to the place where smoke and electricity and the possibility of help lived. Words, though, seemed suddenly clumsy in his mouth, too blunt an instrument for the fine balance of this moment, and in the end he did nothing more than incline his head in a small, oddly formal nod, a gesture that might have been ridiculous if anyone else had been awake to witness it, but which, between him and the wolves in the wet grass, felt exactly right. The torn-eared wolf's ears flicked once, as if catching some sound he could not hear. Then it turned slowly, without haste or drama, and padded back into the deeper darkness of the trees, its body dissolving into the vertical lines of trunks after only a few strides. The others followed in its wake, their shapes slipping away one by one, until the forest edge looked as blank and impassive as it had before he stepped out of it, carrying only the faint lingering smell of wet fur, to prove that they had been there at all. He stood for a moment, alone now, the quiet around him suddenly full not of threat, but of potential doors that could open, voices that could answer, engines that could start, and then he forced his stiff legs to move toward the house, following the packed dirt that served as a path to the porch. Each step made a soft sucking sound as his boots pulled away from the saturated ground, and at the base of the steps he wiped them automatically on the edge of the bottom stair, a pointless ingrained courtesy that made him feel, briefly and absurdly, like a man coming home late, rather than a stranger arriving with disaster in his pockets. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, not alarmingly, but in the familiar way of timber that had been drying and soaking, heating and cooling for years, and as he climbed, the smell of smoke and cooking grew stronger, threaded now with hints of old coffee and fried onions and the faint sour sweetness of linoleum cleaner. At the top, he paused in front of the door, its paint peeling in thin curls that revealed older colors underneath white blew over some long faded green, and raised his good hand to knock, his injured one resting carefully against the front of Karlov's coat. The wood was cold under his knuckles, and the sound his knocking made felt strangely small, given everything that had led up to it, a series of dull, hollow thuds that could easily have been swallowed by a louder storm or a running television. He waited, listening to the house the way he had listened to the forest, trying to separate the internal creaks and hums from the external hush, and for a few seconds there was nothing but the low drone of the transformer, and the soft hiss of the mist against the metal roof. Then, from somewhere inside, came the scrape of a chair leg on a floor, the muffled clink of something being set down on a table, and a man's voice, thick with sleep and suspicion, calling out, "Yeah," hold on in a tone that suggested this was not the hour he expected visitors, and certainly not the hour he welcomed them. The deadbolt clicked, the doorknob turned, and the door opened a narrow crack, held in place by a chain that allowed only a few inches of space. In that gap, framed by the chipped paint and the warm air spilling from inside, Alex saw a man in his late 50s or early 60s, his gray hair raked back in impatient lines, his face lined in the ways that come from sun and squinting rather than boardrooms, wearing a white undershirt and flannel pajama pants, one bare foot and one socked, as if he had been half ready to go out before deciding he didn't need to. The man's eyes flicked over Alex's face, down to the mud on his pants, up again to the blood-darkened bandage on his hand, and the soaked borrowed coat, then past him to the yard and the line of trees beyond, as if checking to make sure he wasn't the lead element in some late-night drama that would spill more bodies onto the porch. "You lost," the man said, and it was not a question asked out of concern so much as a challenge, as if being lost at this hour in this weather demanded an explanation that had better be good. "There's a bus," Alex said, and his voice came out rough, as if it had been unused for hours, which he realized it mostly had, aside from mutters and a few words to the wolves, up on the pass. "Route 221. We hit a slide. Right front wheels gone into the washout and the shoulders coming apart underneath. 11 people on board. No cell service. We need a tractor or a tow, something heavy enough to pull us back before the rest of the road lets go. The man's expression shifted, not softening exactly, but recalibrating. Suspicion gave ground to something more practical, a mental inventory being taken of available machinery, neighbors, the condition of the road between here and the pass. He shut the door just enough to slide the chain off, then opened it fully, the warm air from inside washing over Alex like a physical thing, carrying the smell of boiled potatoes and bacon grease and wood smoke, and an old dog that had been lying in the same spot on the rug for years. "My name's Frank," he said, stepping back and gesturing Alex inside with a curt jerk of his chin that managed to be both brusque and hospitable. "Set your boots on that mat. Don't drip all over my floor more than you have to. Then tell me exactly where that bus is hung up." The kitchen he stepped into was small and cluttered and profoundly welcoming in a way that had nothing to do with decor. A round table sat in the middle of the room, scarred with decades of meals and projects and arguments, an ashtray with 2 crushed cigarette butts, still curling smoke on its surface. A pot sat on the back burner of the stove, lit askew, steam puffing gently from the gap. There were magnets on the fridge in the shape of cartoon animals, and a calendar from a feed store pinned to the wall, each square marked with cramped handwriting doctor's appointments, church bake sales, the word "hey" repeated in several places. Frank moved with the efficient irritability of someone used to being woken by things worth getting out of bed, calves being born in storms, pipes freezing, power flickering, and as he listened to Alex sketch the situation in more detail, he crossed to a pegboard by the back door where keys dangled under scribbled labels. He plucked one set free, the metal jingling in his hand, then reached for a second set and tossed them onto the table with a clatter. "Buzz is stuck on the city side of the pass," Alex said, tracing a rough map on the table with his finger, damp sleeve leaving a faint trail. "Road's 2-lane blacktop, cut bank on one side, drop on the other, no guardrail. We're hanging just past the 47 marker, piece of the shoulder let go under the right front. Soil's saturated up there." It was still settling when I left. Frank grunted, a low sound that might have been sympathy or simply acknowledgement. "Road's been trying to go on that stretch since they cut it. They patch, it slides, they patch again like painting over rot. You said 11 folks. Any kids?" One boy, Alex said, feeling the words snag in his throat as he spoke them, the image of Danny's small sleeping face popping into his mind. 5 years old, couple older women. One guy with a twisted ankle from trying to push, rest or shaken up, but okay. For now, that's all I needed to hear, Frank said, and the flatness in his voice sharpened, as if something heavy inside him had clicked into place. He grabbed the second set of keys from the table and jerked his head toward the adjoining room. "Earl's got the tractor that can pull you off that edge without going over himself. He lives right next door and sleeps like a rock unless something blows up. I'll go pound on him till he wakes. You got enough in you to ride back up right now." Alex's legs ached in a way that suggested they would prefer a chair and 6 hours of not moving. But the thought of the bus sitting up there with every minute of rain chewing a little more at the hillside made the decision for him. "I'm not sitting down until that bus is on level ground," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his own voice, the way it sounded more like the man he used to be before 8 years of second-guessing had worn him down. "Good," Frank said, as if that were the only answer he would have accepted, "because we've burned enough night already." As Frank shoved his feet into a pair of work boots without bothering with socks, Alex stood near the table, the warmth of the room starting to penetrate the damp layers of his clothing, making the ache in his muscles shift from sharp to deep. His hand throbbed under the bandage, the dried blood starting to crack as the skin swelled, and Frank's gaze snagged on it as he straightened, his eyes narrowing. "You fall?" he asked, and when Alex nodded, he made a noncommittal sound. "Got some peroxide and bandages if you don't want that turning into more trouble than it already is, but I'm guessing we're on the clock here. We'll deal with it when we get back." The casual assumption that they would, in fact, be getting back from this, that the night would end with them returning to this kitchen and tending to smaller wounds after the big problem had been handled, settled over Alex like another layer of warmth, as effective in its own way as the stove's heat. It was not blind optimism, it was the straightforward attitude of a man who had seen enough bad nights to know that you approached them as solvable until they proved otherwise. Frank snapped off the stove burner, slid the pot to a cool element, then reached into a cupboard and pulled out two mismatched mugs, pouring thick dark coffee into both from an old drip pot that looked like it had been in service since the 80s. He handed one to Alex without asking if he wanted it, and the first mouthful, bitter and lukewarm and tasting faintly of whatever had been brewed in the pot last week, hit his stomach like fuel, waking up a part of him that had started to sag, reminding him that he had not eaten since before the root, that his body ran on more than adrenaline. "Come on," Frank said, setting his own mug down unfinished and grabbing a heavy canvas jacket from a hook. "You can tell the rest in the truck." Earl's gonna argue about going up there in the dark because he likes to pretend his tractor is older and more delicate than it is, but he won't say no with a kid on that bus. Not around here. They stepped back out into the night, the brief time in the kitchen, making the air feel colder, sharper, though the mist had eased even further, reduced now to a fine sheen on the metal roof, and a faint beating on the hood of the truck. The sky above the village was a uniform, low ceiling of cloud, reflecting back a ghost of light from the few street lamps and porch bulbs, so that the darkness here felt thinner, less absolute than it had under the forest canopy, yet no less heavy. The house next door was only a few yards away across a patch of yard bounded by a sagging wire fence, its outline similar to Frank's, but with an attached lean too full of haphazardly stacked firewood, and the hulking shape of a tractor's rear end just visible in the shadows. A single porch light burned above the door, throwing a cone of yellow onto the steps, and in that circle of light, Alex could see a pair of boots abandoned haphazardly, one lying on its side, the other upright, as if their owner had kicked them off on his way in, too tired to aim. Frank didn't bother with niceties. He strode up the steps and hammered on the door with the side of his fist, the sound loud enough in the sleeping village that Alex half expected another light to wink on further down the lane. After a moment, there was a shuffling noise inside, the faint thud of something being bumped, and a man's voice, rougher and fuller than Frank's, barked, "If this ain't a fire, it can wait till morning through the wood." "It's worse than a fire," Earl Frank called back. "It's the damn county road department and their half-assed patching jobs. Open up." The door swung open to reveal a man a little younger than Frank, maybe in his early 50s, with a broad, square face softened by sleep and a week's worth of stubble, wearing a faded t-shirt with the logo of a long-closed gas station stretched over his belly. He blinked at them, then focused on Alex, taking in his appearance in one long, assessing sweep that ended on the bandaged hand and the line of dried mud up his legs. "What did you boys do?" he asked, the initial irritation in his tone already beginning to dissolve under the weight of his curiosity. "Lose a bet with the mountain. There's a bus stuck on the pass," Frank said, dispensing with preamble. Road slid under the right front, bunch of folks hanging over a drop where there ought to be guardrail. No phones. No tow truck gonna make it up there in this. We need your tractor and that chain you brag about to pull them back before they go where the shoulder went. Kid on board." Earl's eyebrows twitched upward at the word kid, and Alex saw, in that small involuntary movement, the same heavy mechanism engaged that he had seen in Frank's kitchen, the one labeled no choice. "Damn," Earl said, rubbing a hand over his face, the last of the sleep clearing out of his eyes. "They put up a sign 3 months back saying road work ahead and never did a damn thing beyond knocking down a couple of loose rocks. Shoulda known that was coming back to bite somebody." He stepped back into the house without another word and reappeared moments later pulling on heavy overalls over his t-shirt, the straps snapping into place with a practiced flick, then sat on the top step to jam his feet into the wading boots with more precision than Frank had bothered with his. He grabbed a thick knit cap from a hook and pulled it down over his ears as he descended the steps. His movements quick and economical now, the grumbling tone of his earlier complaint shifting into something more focused. "How many folks you say?" he asked, heading for the lean-to where the tractor loomed in the dark, its silhouette angular and massive, tires caked with layers of dried mud from 100 past jobs. 11, Alex said, feeling the number as a weight rather than a statistic. One kid, one older woman, one guy with a busted ankle. Rest are scared and cold, same as you'd expect. Ground's soft under the rear wheels, but they're holding. For now, Earl grunted, already hauling the heavy barn-style door aside to expose more of the tractor, its green paint dulled by years, but still visible under the grime. "You sure the road can handle me getting up there?" he asked, but his hands were already moving to check the fuel line, the connections on the tow hitch, the condition of the chain coiled like a sleeping metal snake on a hook nearby. "No," Alex said, because lying felt like a luxury he'd used up earlier in life, "but I'm sure the bus can handle staying where it is much longer. And I'm sure we don't have time to argue about what the county should have done." Frank snorted a brief humorless laugh. "County should have put up a big sign says you're on your own past this point, save everybody the trouble of pretending otherwise." Earl shot Alex a sharp look over the hood of the tractor. "You the driver?" he asked, as if needing to attach the blame and the responsibility to a single identifiable object. "I am," Alex said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Name's Alex. The decision to stop was mine. The road giving way under us was not. I left them up there to come down here and get you. That was mine too." For a moment, the three men stood in the damp glow of Earl's porch light, the tractor between them like some hulking practical altar, and the air felt heavy with all the words they could say about fault and fate, and the way mountain infrastructure was left to rot until it failed in ways that killed people. Then Earl grunted again, this time in something like rough approval. "Good," he said. "If you'd sat there waiting on somebody else to make the call, we'd be talking about a different kind of trip." He climbed up into the tractor's cab, the metal steps ringing under his boots, and turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then rumbled to life, a deep vibrating growl that seemed to reach up into the rafters of the lean-to and shake dust loose. The sound, after hours of listening only to rain and creak and his own heartbeat, made Alex's chest loosen in a way he hadn't realized it was tight. This was a noise he understood, machinery waking up obediently to a human request. Frank jerked his head toward his own truck. "You ride with Earl and show him exactly where he's going," he said. "I'll follow with the chains and whoever else we pick up on the way. There's one more house on the road up where Hank's probably still awake watching whatever sorry game is on. He's got a winch we might want." Alex nodded, the logistics settling around him like a harness, something familiar and almost comforting in their complexity, and climbed into the tractor's cab beside Earl, the warmth from the engine already beginning to seep through the metal floor. As Earl eased the machine out of the lean-to and toward the narrow lane, its headlights cutting twin cones of glaring white through the mist, Alex glanced back once, purely on instinct, toward the line of trees at the far edge of the houses. The forest was a dark, irregular wall beyond the last yard, its trunks and branches absorbing the stray light from the village and returning none of it, and he could see nothing of the wolves who had led him here, no glint of eyes, no shifting shadows. Yet he felt their absence as distinctly as he had felt their presence earlier, not as a loss exactly, but as a closing of a chapter, the way the sound of rain on the roof of the bus had changed once he turned off the engine the first time. "Tell me everything about that stretch of road," Earl said, eyes fixed ahead as he guided the tractor onto the gravel, its tires crunching loudly in the quiet village, the sound no doubt sliding under closed doors and into the dreams of sleeping residents. "Every dip, every curve, every soft shoulder, like I've never seen it before." Alex took a breath and began to describe the pass in detail, his mouth moving while his mind, in some quiet, separate corner, held on to the echo of padded footsteps in wet leaves, The flash of a torn ear in the beam of his light, and the thin rusted circle of a collar buried in thick fur, a reminder that the line between the world he was driving back into and the one he had just left was less clean than he had ever allowed himself to believe. The tractor felt, from the inside, less like a machine and more like a small, determined animal, its heavy tires worrying their way up the gravel lane with a kind of stubborn intelligence, each spin of the tread biting into wet stone and packed dirt, as if the vehicle itself understood that this was not a casual midnight run to move hay bales, but a climb into a place where the road had already proven it could not be trusted. And as Alex sat in the passenger seat with the faint smell of diesel and old grease filling his nose, the contrast between this cab and the bus he had left behind struck him hard enough that for a moment he could not speak. In the bus, he had always been the one with his hands on the controls, the man whose decisions about speed and braking and lane choice dictated whether the long, unwieldy body behind him slipped through tight spaces or clipped them. Here, he was a passenger again, half at the mercy of another man's judgment, half at the mercy of the mountain's mood. And that helplessness scraped against old habits and older fears, summoning echoes of the night 8 years ago when he had sat in a supervisor's office, listening to someone else tell the story of what he had done, spinning his caution into insubordination. Earl drove with the easy competence of someone who had learned to operate machinery on ground that never stopped trying to reclaim it, one big hand resting lightly on the wheel, the other on the gear shift, his eyes narrowed against the glare of his own headlights on the wet road. The beam picked out the familiar contours of Pinewood's short stretch of pavement, the sagging mailboxes, the patches of gravel where the asphalt had given up years ago and no one had bothered to fix it, the small square church with its steeple jutting into the low clouds, but then the last house fell away behind them, and the road narrowed to a 2-lane ribbon of black. That curved up into the trees, the painted center line half eaten by years of patchwork and neglect. Frank's pickup followed behind, its headlights bouncing in the tractor's mirrors, and somewhere further back a third pair of lights joined, pale and jittery, as if their owner had decided that if there was something worth waking up the big machines for, he might as well tag along with whatever tools and stubbornness he possessed. The little convoy's engines and tires were the only sounds in the night beyond the hiss of the mist on the windscreen and the occasional rattle of loose chains in the pickup's bed, and as they climbed, the village's faint electrical hum faded, replaced by the deeper silence of trees and rock. "Road's gonna start getting squirrely after the next bend," Alex said, forcing his attention outward, away from the loop of worry that kept trying to pull him back into imagining the bus sliding in his absence. They paved over an old slide there 2 years ago and never dug out the base layer. Looks smooth, but it rides like a mattress on a trampoline when it's wet. Earl grunted, a sound halfway between acknowledgement and contempt, and eased off the throttle, the tractor's engine dropping into a lower register. The headlights swept around the bend and lit up the stretch of road Alex had been thinking of, and even through the wet sheen he could see the subtle ripple in the asphalt, the way the surface dipped and rose in gentle waves, betraying the weakness underneath. The tractor rolled over it with a muted rhythmic thump, each tire compressing and releasing the soft layer, and Alex felt the sensation in his teeth in the bands of muscle along his neck. "You weren't kidding," Earl muttered, adjusting his grip on the wheel. "They'll let that go until half the hillside comes with it, then sit around wondering why the hell it cost so much to fix." "Because no one's down here when it's raining," Alex said, before he could stop himself, the bitterness rising uninvited. "They look at the mountain on a clear day and forget what it does when it's mad." The road continued to climb, the trees crowding closer, the branches arching overhead like the beams of an old nave, and the higher they went, the thicker the mist became, the visible world shrinking beyond the reach of the headlights. Water trickled across the asphalt in narrow veins in places, shining brighter than the rest of the surface, signs that the hill above was shedding the last of the day's rain, and each tiny rivulet made Alex's stomach tighten, because he had seen what those small threads could turn into when given enough time. "How long you say you've been gone?" Earl asked, not taking his eyes off the road. "I left them at about 10 to 10, Alex said, checking his watch out of reflex, even though the numbers there now felt almost accusatory. It was around 11 when I realized I was walking myself in circles. Took me another hour and change to get here with the help I didn't know I needed. It's after 12 now, maybe closer to 1. He didn't mention the wolves in that quick calculation, not because he was ashamed or afraid of sounding crazy though. He suspected that if he tried to describe that part of the journey in the tight practical space of the tractor cab, it would come out sounding like an apology for something he didn't regret, but because there was simply no useful way to fit a pack of wild animals. Made sure I didn't walk off a cliff into the logistics of chain lengths and tow angles. Grounds had 3 hours to think about what it wants to do, then Earl said, and the way he phrased it, as if the land itself had intentions, ticked something in Alex's mind, a resonance with his father's old talk about listening to hillsides and reading forest moods. "We'll have to see if it decided to be generous or not." They hit the first of the tighter switchbacks, the ones Alex had driven 100 times in daylight without thinking, and had crept through in the rain with a bus full of sleeping passengers, and the tractor's engine labored as it pulled the heavy machine around the bend, the headlights flaring briefly against the exposed rock face on the uphill side, before swinging out over the drop on the downhill, revealing a brief glimpse of the ravine below, nothing more than a churning black void, veined with faint reflections off the swollen creek. The sight made his palms sweat, and he wiped his good hand reflexively on his pants, the damp fabric doing little to dry it. He imagined the bus hanging somewhere ahead on the same road, its front end dipped toward that void, the right front wheel buried in mud where earth used to be, and he had to breathe deliberately, in through his nose, out through his mouth, to keep his mind from sliding into the scene in a way that would paralyze him. Behind them, the pickup's headlights vanished momentarily as it took the curve, then reappeared, and Alex thought, with a flicker of gratitude he could not quite articulate, about the fact that these men had gotten out of warm beds and into cold machines on the strength of a stranger's story and the mention of a child. There was something in that movement, a tractor rolling up into danger, not because someone had ordered it, but because someone had asked, that stood in quiet, stubborn opposition to the absentee decisions made in distant offices. As they climbed, the mist thickened into a more substantial fog, the headlights of the tractor turning the air in front of them into a glowing wall of white that seemed almost solid, reflecting off droplets and making it harder to see what lay beyond. Earl slowed further, his foot easing off the accelerator, and leaned forward slightly, as if proximity would sharpen his vision. "Visibility's crap," he said, voice a little tighter now. "If your mile marker's off, we'll be on top of that bus before I know it." "We won't," Alex said, surprising himself with the certainty in his tone. "There's a slight camber change about a quarter mile before the slide, a hump in the center where they layered asphalt wrong. You'll feel it in the wheel and in your spine. After that, the cut bank on the left drops back a yard or two. You'll see more sky over the hood on that side. That's where we start treating the road like it's made of glass." Earl glanced at him just for a second, the corners of his mouth twitching. "You talk about that road like it's a woman you've been arguing with for 20 years. Alex shrugged, feeling heat prick his face in the dim cab. When you run the same route long enough, you stop thinking in terms of miles and start thinking in terms of moods. This stretch sulks when it's cold. That one throws tantrums when it's hot. The pass up here," he gestured vaguely ahead, "likes to pretend it's fine until it isn't." "You're not wrong," Earl said, and there was a note of reluctant respect in his voice now. "All right, you tell me when she starts pouting." They rolled on, the engine a steady growl under their feet, and as the minutes ticked by, Alex could feel the shift he had described long before his brain put words to it. The wheel, under his light grip on the passenger side, picked up a new kind of vibration, a faint but insistent buzz that traveled up through the column from the contact patches of the front tires. The tractor's body swayed differently over a barely visible rise, and the sensation of the cut bank on the left pressing close eased almost imperceptibly as the road's profile altered. Here he said, the word coming out sharper than he intended. "We're getting close." Earl nodded, jaw tightening, and slowed them to a crawl, the tractor's big tires now rolling with a cautious deliberation that matched the way Alex had tested the shoreline of that hidden stream earlier, towing for a solid rock beneath the water. The fog ahead thickened further, swallowing the world beyond the reach of their beams, and in that compressed bubble of visibility, every foot of pavement felt charged, like the strip of roadway just before a bridge whose supports you don't entirely trust. For a few endless seconds, there was nothing but wet asphalt in front of them, gleaming up from the headlights with a uniform deceptive smoothness, the kind of silky sheen that hid microfractures and hairline breaks. Then, gradually, a darker shape began to coalesce out of the white, at first just a suggestion of mass, a smudge where the light did not reflect as cleanly, and then, as they crept closer, the outline resolved into lines and angles that Alex's muscles recognized before his conscious mind did. The bus sat ahead of them, frozen at a crooked angle across the lane, its rear end still solidly on the intact portion of the road, its front listing toward the drop with a tilt that made Alex's stomach flip, even though he was not on it. The reflective stripe along its side caught the tractor's light and flashed back a dull, wavering band of white, and in the windows he saw faint movements, figures shifting, drawn to the new glow like insects to a porch lamp, small rectangles of weaker bluish illumination inside, revealing the occasional silhouette of a raised arm, a bowed head, the outline of a child. For a terrible second, he thought the front end had dipped further than when he left, that the right front corner was lower, closer to the void. But as the tractor edged nearer and the perspective changed, he realized that though the mud had slumped more under the tire, pulling it deeper, the remaining strip of asphalt under the frame had held. A narrow stress shelf supporting more weight than it should, like a tendon stretched to its limit, but not yet snapped. His throat tightened, and a hot prickling pressure gathered at the backs of his eyes, not quite tears and not quite relief, and he swallowed hard against both as Earl let out a low whistle, the sound carrying more awe than he would likely admit to later. "Well, I'll be damned," Earl said. "She's still up, for now." The tractor's headlights washed over the faces in the bus windows, and Alex saw them more clearly Marina's pale-drawn features as she turned toward the light, eyes white and reflecting the beams, Danny's head lolling against her shoulder, still asleep in the unnatural way children sometimes did through storms and arguments, Karlov's silhouette near the front. One hand braced on the seat back, the other shading his eyes as he tried to see past the glare. The sight of them hit Alex like a physical blow, knocking something loose inside him that had been tightening since he stepped into the forest. They were there, they were upright, they had not slid without him. The gratitude that surged through him was fierce and wild, edged with guilt, because alongside the relief came the knowledge that he had been gone long enough, that the outcome could easily have been otherwise, that if the mountain had chosen to shrug a little harder, this scene would look very different. "Pull up just short of the rear bumper," he said, voice hoarse with the effort of keeping it steady. "We don't want the vibration of you stopping hard to be the thing that finally tips her." Earl did, feathering the brakes until the tractor came to a gentle halt with a few yards to spare. The pickup pulled in behind them, its engine ticking as it idled, and the third vehicle, a battered older SUV, stopped a little further back, its headlights dimming as the driver cut the engine. Doors opened, boots hit wet pavement, and the quiet night that had held this suspended disaster for hours filled with the low, purposeful sounds of men gearing up for work. Alex opened the tractor door and climbed down carefully, his legs stiff, his injured hand throbbing in time with his heart. The air up here was colder than in the valley, the mist heavier, beating instantly on his face and hair, and the smell of wet earth and exhaust, and the faint tang of fear that seeped from the bus blended into a sharp metallic mix that made the back of his throat ache. As he stepped toward the bus, the front door hissed and folded open with a sound he knew as well as his own breath, and MARIN0 appeared at the top of the steps, one arm around the pole, the other wrapped around Danny, who had finally woken and was blinking in the glare, his hair a damp halo around his small, confused face. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the few yards of slick asphalt, the night and everything in it compressed into that narrow channel. She did not say anything at first, and neither did he. There were too many words that could fail under the weight of what they both knew about the time that had passed, the risks he had taken, and the ones he had left them to carry. Instead, she gave a single sharp nod, the movement full of something more complex than simple gratitude. It held anger and relief, and a grudging respect for the fact that he had, in fact, brought help. He nodded back, feeling the knot in his chest loosen another notch. Behind her, Karlov squeezed into the doorway, one hand still on his phone, though there was now a single bar of service showing in the corner, thanks to their elevation, and the tractor's headlights catching whatever signals could make it through. He looked older than he had in the depot, his bravado scuffed down to something quieter, but his voice, when he spoke, still carried its old force. "Took your time," he said, and though the words could have landed as an accusation, there was an exhausted roughness to them that blunted the edge, turned them into something closer to a reflexive jab thrown in the aftermath of a shared ordeal. "Got lost," Alex said, because the truth, stripped of its strange middle chapters, was still the truth. Then found some better navigators than me, brought a tractor. Let's get you all off this edge before the road remembers what it was trying to do. Earl and Frank were already uncoiling the heavy chain from the back of the pickup, its links clanking and scraping as they dragged it along the wet road, the metal shining dully under the headlights. The third man, Hank, based on the way Frank called his name, was setting up portable work lights on stands, their harsh white glare adding another layer of brightness to the scene, turning the mist into a glowing haze. They worked quickly but not sloppily, moving with the rhythm of people who had spent years wrangling stubborn machinery in worse conditions than this. Earl slit under the rear of the bus to find a secure point on the frame, his boots protruding from beneath the bumper, while Frank guided the chain toward the tractor's hitch, his hand sure despite the wet metal. Hank hovered at the edge of the drop with a flashlight, watching for any sign of new movement in the mud under the front wheels, calling out brief updates in a voice that carried over the muted clatter. Alex moved among them, his body remembering automatically the protocols of hooking and hauling angles to avoid, lines of tension to respect, the way weight transferred along a chain when a vehicle started to move. His hand hurt with every grip, but he ignored it, the pain folding into the general background hum of the night. He was aware, at the edge of his vision, of the passengers inside the bus pressing against windows or craning their necks in the aisle, trying not to jostle each other, as they watched the men outside tie their fate to a length of metal and the stubbornness of a tractor. When the last shackle was secured and the chain pulled taut, Earl climbed back into the tractor cab, his face set in a look of focused concentration that had no room for jokes or commentary. He glanced once at Alex, who had taken up position near the rear wheel on the uphill side, ready to shout if he saw the frame shift in a way that spelled disaster, and then put the tractor gently into gear. The chain tightened with a slow groaning sound, the links straightening one by one as the slack disappeared. The bus shuddered, a full-body flinch that made a collective murmur rise from inside. The right front corner seemed for an awful moment to sink another inch into the mud, the torn raw edge of the shoulder crumbling a little more, but then the rear wheels bit, their treads chewing into the soft asphalt and the more stable earth beneath. And the massive vehicle began to move backward millimeter by millimeter, the entire structure vibrating like a living thing, resisting being dragged from a bad dream. Alex held his breath without meaning to, every muscle in his body clenched as if he were the one pulling, and he could see in the tight set of Earl's shoulders through the cab window that the driver felt it too, the strain of the machine under him, the way the tractor's rear end skittered slightly sideways on the wet surface before finding purchase. Frank and Hank kept pace with the bus as it inched back, their eyes flicking between the tires and the edge of the drop, ready to wave Earl off if something shifted too fast. The right front wheel climbed, slowly, out of the mud pocket that had been trying to hold it, the suction breaking with a sucking sound that sprayed dirt and water outward. The bus's nose lifted a fraction, the terrible forward tilt easing into something closer to level, and as it did, a sound rose from inside, a kind of collective exhale, half sob, half exhausted laugh that Alex felt in his bones. The chain groaned again, stretching, and then, with a final stubborn lurch, the bus slid fully back onto intact asphalt, all four wheels once again on ground that, while not entirely trustworthy, was at least all there. "Hold it," Hank shouted, and Earl eased off the gas, the tractor's engine dropping back into a contented rumble. The chain sagged slightly as the tension released, and for a moment there was a profound ringing silence, broken only by the soft patter of the mist and the ticking of cooling metal. Alex realized he was shaking, not from cold, though the damp had sunk into every layer of his clothing, but from the sudden absence of a fear he had been carrying in his muscles for hours. His knees felt loose, his injured hand throbbed, as if remembering it existed, now that the larger crisis was easing, and he had to put a hand against the bus's side to steady himself, the cold wet metal solid under his palm, the familiar contour of the panel grounding him. Inside the bus, people began to move in earnest, voices rising, some laughing a little too loudly, some crying quietly, the pent-up energy of their fear-seeking release in motion. Marina appeared at the door again, this time without Danny in her arms. He stood beside her, one small hand gripping her jeans, his eyes huge in his narrow face, taking in the tractor and the men and the thick chain with the stunned solemnity of a child who knows something serious has happened, even if the details escape him. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice high and thin, carrying surprisingly clearly over the various adult noises. Almost Alex said, and for once the word felt like an honest compromise between what he wished he could say and what was true. "We're off the edge. We're going down to Pinewood. You're gonna sleep in a real bed or on somebody's floor and eat something warm that isn't from a vending machine. After that, you get to be bored again. That's the plan." Danny nodded slowly, as if weighing this promise against the evidence of the night, and then, in a small decisive movement, he let go of his mother's jeans and stepped down one stair, closer to Alex. Marina's hand twitched as if to pull him back, but she stopped herself, watching. "You came back," the boy said, and there was no accusation in it, only the simple recognition of a fact that had not been guaranteed. "I did," Alex said, and for the first time in a very long time, he let the satisfaction of having followed through on a heart-uncertain course wash over him without immediately discounting it with a list of what could have gone wrong or what he might have done better. "And I'm going to get you the rest of the way home." Somewhere behind him, Frank began giving brisk, practical instructions about how many people could ride in which vehicle, who would go in the bus down to Pinewood, and who would cram into trucks to make room for the possibility that the road might close completely behind them if the hillside decided to let go. The night was not finished with them yet. There were still miles to cover and reports to make and tired, skeptical dispatchers to convince that what had happened up here was not a minor delay, but a near miss. Yet as Alex stood there, the bus solid under his hand, the tractor idling like a big contented animal at rest, and the mist beginning to thin just enough that the outline of the pass could be seen against the lighter stain of the sky, he felt, beneath the exhaustion and the lingering fear, a quiet steady thread of something that had been missing for 8 years in acceptance, that is choices. Imperfect and risky and made in the dark with limited information, had not this time destroyed lives but saved them, and that the night, with all its strange guides and tests, had given him back a part of himself he had almost forgotten how to carry. By the time the last of the passengers were settled into borrowed beds and onto couches and hastily unrolled sleeping bags on the floors of Pinewood's houses, the sky over the eastern ridge had begun to pale in that slow, uncertain way that made it hard to tell where the night ended and the day began, the heavy lid of cloud that had sat over the mountains all evening, gradually thinning into layers that let a little light sift through, turning the mist that still hung in the hollows from gray to a faint washed-out blue. The bus, freed from the edge, now sat pulled off onto the whitest patch of shoulder near the village, its hazard lights still blinking a tired, steady pattern that made it look less like a vehicle and more like a stranded ship signaling over and over to an empty sea. The engine was off, the interior dark, its familiar smells of vinyl and stale coffee and recycled air temporarily abandoned in favor of the richer, more specific odors of people's home's fried eggs, damp wool blankets, floor polish, old books, wood smoke. Inside Frank's kitchen, the round table that had been cluttered earlier with ashtrays and keys and half-finished mugs of coffee now held a different kind of mess, a scattering of paperwork from Alex's driver's bag, a lined notebook that served as the route log, a couple of cheap pens, and a disposable cup of gas station coffee one of the neighbors had produced from somewhere. Its plastic lid stained brown around the drinking slot. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, casting everything in a harsh, flat glow that felt too bright for eyes that had spent the last several hours reading the world in gradients of darkness. Alex sat hunched over the logbook, his injured hand wrapped in clean gauze, now that Frank's wife had insisted on scrubbing the old bandage off with a thoroughness that had made him grit his teeth and bite back undignified sounds. The fresh dressing was neat and tight, the skin beneath stinging in that oddly reassuring way that said things were clean and healing rather than festering. He held the pen in his left hand, his writing slower and more deliberate than usual, the letters larger, as if he were relearning the motion. He wrote down times and mile markers and brief descriptions of events, compressing hours of fear and mud and wolves and chains and diesel into a series of bland factual lines that would be legible to someone who had never left a climate-controlled office. Departed Hendersonville, 1840, weather rain, light traffic. Reached mile 47 on US 221 approx 2115. Observed shoulder failure, right front wheel in subsidence. Passengers remained on board. Driver proceeded on foot to Pinewood to obtain assistance. Tractor retrieval initiated approx 220. Bus removed from slide without injury or further damage. He listed the names of the passengers as best he could recall them from the roster and the hurried head count after the pull, underlining no injuries twice, not for any official reason, but because the act of writing it felt like hammering a stake into the ground. The phone call to his dispatcher had been exactly the kind of conversation he had expected and, in a strange way, prepared for since the tire first dropped. It had taken 3 attempts to get through, the signal in the valley as spotty as ever, despite all the upgrades the company had claimed to have made, and when the line finally connected, the familiar. Perpetually harried voice on the other end had gone from sleepy to shrill in under 30 seconds, as Alex laid out the bare bones of the night. You left the vehicle unattended with passengers on board, the dispatcher had said, each word sharp, clipping into the receiver with the precision of a scalpel. You deviated from the approved emergency protocol. You exposed the company to unnecessary liability by involving unauthorized third parties in the recovery process. Do you have any idea? Everyone is alive, Alex had said, cutting across the gathering storm, his own voice low but carrying. The bus is off a failed shoulder that would have taken it into a ravine if we'd sat waiting for a tow that couldn't get past the first washout. The passengers are in houses, warm, uninjured. A child slept through most of it. You can write me up for the rest. There had been a buzzing pause, as if the dispatcher's outrage had hit an unexpected wall and needed to regroup. When the voice came back, it was thinner, cooler, the shape of it more about damage control than anger. Company policy requires an incident report filed within 24 hours, the dispatcher had said. You are to remain with the vehicle until a supervisor arrives. Do not move it from its current location. Do not discuss fault or accept responsibility with passengers or media. We will review camera footage and GPS logs. In the meantime, you're suspended from active duty pending investigation. Suspended. The word had landed like an old familiar blow, but this time it did not knock him back in the same way. 8 years ago, he had stood in a fluorescent hallway and heard a similar phrase framed as a consequence for doing what he believed was right, and it had hollowed him out from the inside, made him doubt every instinct thereafter. Tonight, with his pen scratching across the logbook and the smell of fresh bread rising from the counter where Frank's wife had set a covered bowl of dough to proof hours earlier, the word felt less like a verdict and more like a bureaucratic reflex, a company flinching from the thought of being sued. He wrote it down anyway in the margin of his notebook, suspended pending investigation, as if by putting it in his own handwriting he could contain it, keep it from unraveling the night's other truths. The letters looked smaller than the rest, gray where the ink had thinned under his lighter, left-handed pressure. Those city folks don't know their ass from a stump, Frank muttered from across the table, where he sat nursing his own cooling coffee, having heard enough of the dispatcher's tone through the thin cell signal to form an opinion. If you'd sat up there waiting on their approved tow and that bus had gone over, they'd be suspending you for not doing enough. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Only thing that matters is those people breathing in my neighbor's spare beds right now. Alex huffed out a breath that could almost, if one were generous, be called a laugh. They need someone to yell at, he said, setting the pen down for a moment to flex his cramped fingers. I'm convenient. I was there. Papers cleaner if the fault's on the man behind the wheel instead of the road that's been ignored for 10 years. You did what you had to, Frank said, shrugging in that way mountain men had when they declared something closed. We were there. The bus was there. The ground was trying to leave. We pulled it back. End of story. The door to the kitchen opened and Marina stepped in, her hair pulled back in a rough knot, the borrowed flannel shirt she wore over her own t-shirt too big in the shoulders, but buttoned unevenly over her small frame. Her jeans were still damp at the hems, and she was barefoot, her toes curling reflexively against the cool linoleum. Behind her, the muted murmur of voices and the soft clatter of dishes drifted from the living room, where some of the passengers sat on couches with mugs of tea, others stretched out on quilts on the floor, the atmosphere one of exhausted, slightly dazed camaraderie. Danny's out again, she said, leaning lightly against the doorframe, as if testing the strength of the room before stepping fully into it. He made it through half a sandwich, and a piece of that cake your wife gave him, and then fell over like someone turned off his switch. I had to pry the fork out of his hand. Frank's wife, bustling at the counter with a pan and a dish towel, smiled without looking up. He's safe here, she said, her hands moving automatically as she turned dough and covered it, an old routine that had weathered births and deaths and power outages and every other minor drama the valley had thrown at them. All of you are, that's what matters. Marina's gaze slid to the table and the logbook, the phone, the scribbled notes, and then to Alex's face. Her eyes were less sharp now than they had been on the bus, the adrenaline burned off and replaced by a fatigue that sat in the lines at the corners, and the slight droop of her shoulders, but there was still something searching in them, as if she were looking not just at him but through him, gauging what kind of man he was now that the immediate crisis had passed. I heard some of that call, she said, and though she didn't specify which part, he could tell from the way her mouth tightened that it was the suspended that had stuck with her. They're really going to come after you for leaving us up there. They're going to come after me for not following a protocol written by people who have never seen that stretch of road in the rain, he said, forcing his tone to stay level, not wanting to turn this kitchen into a platform for his grievances. They'll do their investigation. They'll watch the camera footage. They'll look at weather reports and maps. Maybe they'll decide I cost them more in liability than I saved them in goodwill. Maybe they won't. Not my call. You knew they'd be mad before you went, she said, not really asking. I had a strong suspicion, he admitted, didn't change what needed doing. For a moment, the only sounds were the soft thump of dough under Frank's wife's hands, the tick of the cooling stove, the distant creak of the old house, settling as the temperature outside shifted. Then Marina pushed off from the doorframe and crossed the room to the table, stopping on the other side of the logbook. She rested her hands on its edge, fingers splayed, the knuckles pale. "I was an asshole to you up there," she said, and the bluntness of the word in her mouth, in this kitchen, gave it a weight that more polite phrasing wouldn't have carried. "I sat behind you and picked at everything your speed, your decisions, your silence, like if I could just get you to talk more, I could make the mountain pay attention to me instead of you. When you said you'd go," I thought she shook her head, a short, angry little jerk at herself. "I thought you were running away from responsibility. And then you walked into that forest." He remembered the way she had stood in the bus doorway, blocking him with nothing but or fear, asking if he would come back, and how he had given her something less than a promise, because anything else would have been a lie. "I've had 8 years of people telling me that when I follow my instincts, bad things happen," he said quietly, more to the table than to her. "Tonight, I had to decide whether to listen to that or to the part of me that knew sitting still was going to get us all killed. I don't blame you for being angry. You had your kid on that bus. That kind of fear doesn't care about the driver's psychology." She huffed out a breath that might have been a laugh if it had had more energy behind it. "Fear doesn't care about much," she said, "but it knows a difference when it sees one. There's the kind where someone panics and runs, and there's the kind where someone looks scared and does the hard thing anyway. I've seen both. You're not the first kind." She reached into the pocket of the borrowed shirt and pulled out something small and crumpled, a foil wrapper flattened between her fingers, and set it down gently on the logbook. He recognized it after a second, the foil Annie had wrapped his sandwich in that morning. The same foil he had wadded up and shoved into his bag after eating somewhere back on the outbound run, before any of this had unfolded. "Your daughter packed you that, right?" Marina said, reading the fleeting surprise on his face. "You told me earlier, before all this, that your little girl had made you a sandwich. I saw you toss the wrapper up behind your seat when you were driving. I grabbed it when the bus moved the first time when the wheel dropped. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if something happened, some part of your life should make it back to you, even if you didn't." The idea that she had, in that chaotic moment of the bus's first lurch, thought to reach for something as small and inconsequential as his sandwich wrapper struck him as almost unbearably tender. He picked up the foil carefully, smoothing its creases with his thumb, the metal catching the kitchen's harsh light in flashes. "Her name's Annie," he said. "She's 8. She thinks I drive the whole world." "She'd be right," Marina said softly, and there was something like a smile in her voice now, at least the part of it that mattered tonight. They stood there for a few breaths in a shared quiet that had nothing to do with exhaustion, and everything to do with the way fear, once spent, left behind a kind of fragile intimacy among those who had weathered it side by side. Alex folded the foil and slid it into his wallet behind his license, a small shining square hidden among the cards and receipts, then picked up the pen again with his left hand and signed the bottom of the log entry. "This is the part where I write that all passengers were delivered safely to alternate accommodations," he said, "and the part they won't read is the rest of it." "The rest of it lives here," Frank's wife said, setting a covered dish on the table with a decisive thunk. "In our heads, in the stories we tell each other next week and next year. Companies forget. Mountains don't care. People remember." Later, after the forms were filled and the coffee pot had been drained twice and refilled once, after Earl had gone home to shower 3 inches of mud off his legs and collapse into bed for an hour before checking his fences, after Hank had returned to his own house with the satisfied, slightly shell-shocked look of a man who had seen something he would be telling and retelling at the bar for months, the house grew quieter. The passengers, lulled by warmth and carbohydrates and the simple physical safety of walls, rotated through the bathroom and the couches and the makeshift beds, their voices softening into a low collective murmur that eventually faded into the breathy, uneven sounds of sleep. Alex found himself unable to lie down yet, his body thrumming with a kind of wired fatigue that made the idea of closing his eyes feel wrong, like leaving a stove burner on. He stepped out onto the front porch, easing the door shut behind him so as not to wake the people scattered across the living room floor. The air outside was cold and damp, but not as biting as it had been on the pass. The wind had dropped, and a thin, steady drizzle had replaced the earlier hard rain, fine enough that it felt more like walking through a low cloud than being rained on. The sky to the east was no longer a flat, unbroken gray. A faint hint of color had begun to seep into it, a pale band of pinkish light at the horizon that promised, if not a clear day, at least a day distinguishable from night. The outline of the ridge was sharp against that light, the trees etched in dark relief like a paper cutout. Somewhere down the road, a rooster crowed prematurely, its hoarse call echoing faintly between the houses, and one of the village's 3 street lamps flickered twice and then blinked off, its timer convinced that enough sunrise had arrived to abdicate its duties. Frank stood at the far end of the porch, leaning against the rail with a cigarette cupped in one hand to keep the drizzle from soaking the tip. The smoke curled up in thin, blue threads, mixing with the mist in a way that made it hard to tell where one ended and the other began. He offered the pack with a tilt of his hand when he saw Alex, and Alex shook his head. He had quit years ago, and tonight did not feel like the night to restart any old habits. "Can't sleep yet," Frank said, not really asking. "Feels wrong too," Alex answered, resting his forearms on the railing. The damp would cool under his skin. "Like I'd be stepping away before the night finishes saying what it needs to." "Night said plenty," Frank said, flicking ash over the edge, "but she might have one more thing up her sleeve. She usually does on nights like this." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the small sounds of the village waking up reluctantly, a truck engine turning over and then falling silent again, a screen door squeaking somewhere, the faint clatter of a feed bucket from a barn up the hill. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke and, faintly, of yeast as the bread in the kitchen continued to rise, a warm promise threaded through the chill. After a few minutes, Frank spoke again, his voice a shade softer, as if the topic warranted a different tone. "You came down through the woods," you said, he began, "not by the road." "Road's worse beyond the slide," Alex said. "Guardrails missing in sections, shoulders undercut. I figured my odds were better with trees under me than air. Turned out the forest had its own opinions." "That she does," Frank said. He took a drag, exhaled, then glanced sideways at Alex. "You see anything up there she hasn't shown the county surveyors?" Alex thought of the wolves, of the ring of reflective eyes in the clearing, of the torn ear and the rusted collar, of the way they had blocked his path at the edges of hidden drops, and guided him along safer contours, as if the mountain itself had sent them to keep him from stepping where earth couldn't hold him. He felt on his tongue the temptation to dress the story up, to render it in the kind of language that would make it easier to dismiss a strange dream, a product of exhaustion and fear, before it could be dismissed by someone else. Then he remembered Frank's matter-of-fact acceptance of the road's moods and the land's intentions. "I saw 5 wolves," he said simply, "or something damned close. One bigger than the rest, torn ear, old collar grown into his neck. They boxed me in when I stumbled onto their clearing. Wouldn't let me go certain ways, steered me others. When we got near here, they stopped at the tree line and watched me walk out into your yard. Then they went back into the dark." Frank's cigarette paused halfway to his mouth, the ember flaring a little brighter as he inhaled sharply through his nose instead. He stared out at the ridge for a long moment, then nodded once, as if confirming something he had suspected. "Old Gray," he said. "Some folks call him that anyway. Been stories about him running around these hills for near 10 years now. Big one, torn ear, collar that no one's ever been close enough to read. Half the valley swears he's just a coyote somebody fed too long. Other half says he's an angel or a demon or some kind of old spirit come to teach people not to be fools." "You," Alex asked, curious despite his exhaustion, "what do you say?" Frank shrugged, the movement slow. "I say he's a wolf that's lived long enough to learn the lay of the land better than any of us, and if he decided not to take a bite out of you when he had you dead to rights, there was a reason. I've heard he's turned hunters away from bad cliffs, led a drunk kid back toward the sound of his own house dog once when he wandered too far in a snowstorm. I don't pretend to know how much is true, but I know I've seen tracks in places where nobody with two legs would have walked in that weather, unless they were lost. And I know you're standing on my porch instead of lying at the bottom of a ravine with your phone blinking useless in your hand. Alex let the stories sit between them, not dismissing them, not inflating them. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it a faint, sharp smell that made him think of wet fur and cold air moving through an animal's lungs, and for a brief moment, nonsensical as it was, he felt as if there were eyes on him from the tree line beyond the last house, watching to make sure he had made it this far. He pushed away from the railing, the wood leaving faint damp prints on his forearms, and stepped down off the porch onto the packed dirt of the yard. The ground was soft, but not treacherous, the previous night's rain having mostly seeped into the thirsty earth. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge, but the light had strengthened enough that he could see his breath in faint puffs, the vapor dissipating quickly in the warming air. He walked toward the lane where Frank's truck was parked, its bed now empty of chains, the mud on its sides drying into dull streaks, and beyond it, near the spot where the tractor's tire tracks curved out toward the main road, he saw something that made him stop. In the damp earth alongside the ruts were a series of impressions, clearest where the soil was still slightly darker, the edges crisp where they had pressed into the ground before the drizzle had a chance to soften them. They were prints, not of boots or tires or any of the usual human clutter, but of paws' large oval pads with 4 distinct toe marks, the claw imprints faint but visible at the tips. The tracks followed the tractor's path for several yards, paralleling the human-made grooves, as if whoever had made them had paced alongside the machine, keeping its own counsel. Alex crouched, his knees protesting the movement, and studied one of the prints more closely. It was deep, suggesting weight, and the distance between it and the next was long enough to indicate a stride that wasn't a casual trot. His bandaged hand pulsed in time with his heartbeat as he steadied himself on the ground, the white gauze bright against the dark soil, and for a moment he placed his own uninjured palm beside the print, measuring the span. The paw was larger than his hand. The tracks continued a few more yards, then angled away from the lane toward the trees, growing fainter as the ground turned from bare earth to leaf litter to moss and roots. After a short distance, they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the forest floor's mottled texture, leaving only the memory of their direction like a line drawn lightly in his mind. He straightened slowly, his back creaking, and stood there for a long moment, the cold seeping up through his boots, the first real light of dawn slipping over the ridge to touch the tops of the trees with a barely perceptible brightness. The world around him was both utterly ordinary, the same muddy lane and sagging fences and low houses that would be here tomorrow, and the day after, and charged with a residue of the night's strangeness, as if the fabric of reality were still slightly crumpled from being handled too roughly. Behind him, the front door opened with a soft squeak, and Frank's wife called his name, saying that the eggs were done and the bread would be out of the oven in 10 minutes, that he should come in and eat before the adrenaline wore off completely, and his body realized just how much he had asked of it. He turned toward the house, taking one last look at the fading paw prints near the tractor ruts, and felt, not certainty, because certainty in matters like this felt like arrogance, but a quiet willingness to let the inexplicable sit alongside the explainable, without forcing one to swallow the other. He walked back up the steps, the wood creaking under his weight, and stepped into the warm, bright clutter of the kitchen, where the smell of fresh bread and bacon and strong coffee wrapped around him like a blanket. Danny was sitting at the table now, hair sticking up in all directions, eyes puffy with sleep, a slice of toast in his hand and a smear of jam on his chin, listening as Karlov, of all people, gestured with a mug and tried to reenact in miniature the moment the bus's nose lifted, embellishing his own bravery, and underplaying his earlier panic in the way survivors of near disasters often did. Old Ruth sat in a chair by the window, a cat curled contentedly in her lap, as if it had always belonged there, her hands moving gently over its fur. She looked up as Alex came in and gave him that same small inscrutable nod she had offered on the bus before he left, as if acknowledging that the line from there to here had been drawn to its natural conclusion. Alex poured himself a cup of coffee, the dark liquid steaming, and slid into an empty chair at the table. As he wrapped his hands around the mug, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers, he realized that the tight, cold knot that had lodged under his sternum 8 years ago, the one that had stiffened every time he approached a difficult decision, whispering that his judgment was suspect, that his instincts were dangerous, had loosened in the night's long passage. It might never vanish completely, scars rarely did, but it no longer felt like a weight dragging him backward. It felt, instead, like a mark he could carry with less shame, like the torn ear of a wolf who had survived enough conflicts to be both wary and wise. Outside, the last of the mist lifted off the valley in pale curling wisps, and the morning settled in with the unremarkable persistence of days and places where life went on, regardless of what the night had tried to do. Somewhere up on the pass, a county truck would, in a few hours, pull up to the spot where the shoulder had given way and set out cones and temporary barriers, men in bright vests measuring distances and shaking their heads, talking about budgets and mitigation, and what could be done in the next fiscal year. In this kitchen, at this table, the calculus was simpler. 11 people who had counted breaths in the dark, now counted bites of toast and sips of coffee, and a man who had walked into a forest with more ghosts than guides now sat among them, tired to his bones, suspended from his route, unsure exactly what his job would look like next week or next month, but carrying. Somewhere inside, a new understanding that the part of him that stepped into the dark had not been the problem all along. He took a drink of coffee, let the bitterness sit on his tongue, and listened as Danny launched into a breathless description of the tractor, from his limited perspective, little hands waving, jam flying in tiny arcs, his fear already alchemizing into a story he would one day tell with the exaggerations of adulthood. Outside the window, the trees at the edge of the village stood in their usual unremarkable arrangement, but now, when Alex looked at them, he could not help but imagine, just beyond where the eye could reach, a gray shape moving silently between the trunks, a torn ear catching the light for the briefest moment before melting back into shadow, watching over the narrow, fragile road that wound between the hard demands of the world and whatever waited in the dark beyond.